I woke up 3 days before my sister's wedding and felt the cold air on my scalp. My hair was gone, shaved clean while I slept. My mother stood in the doorway holding the razor. "You're too pretty," she said. "Melissa can't compete with you. This is for the family." My father laughed from the hallway. "Now you won't ruin the wedding photos." I looked in the mirror at my bald head and felt something break inside me, not my spirit, but my last thread of loyalty to the people who raised me. Because this wasn't about a wedding. This was about control, humiliation, making sure I stayed small. What they didn't know was that I'd just turned 33. And on my 33rd birthday, a lawyer was about to deliver a letter that would shatter everything they'd built their lives on. 20 years of lies, millions of dollars stolen, a lifetime of sabotage. They shaved my head to make me invisible. But when I walked into that wedding 3 days later, I wasn't the broken girl they expected. I was the woman who was about to take everything back. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why revenge is best served with a legal judgment. My name is Jennifer Brooks. I'm 32 years old, turning 33 next week, and I work as a marketing coordinator for a small firm in Columbus. I'd spent the last decade building a quiet, independent life 2 hours away from my childhood home in rural Ohio. But when your little sister gets married, you come back, even when you know exactly how it's going to feel. The house looked the same as it always had. White siding, black shutters. The porch swing my father built the summer Melissa turned 10. I'd asked for one too back then. He said he'd get to it. He never did. I pulled my suitcase from the trunk and stood there for a moment, gathering the courage I always needed before walking through that door. My mother opened it to Yish before I could knock. She looked me up and down, and I watched her smile tighten. "Jennifer, you're here." Not a hug, not a welcome, just a statement of fact. She stepped aside and I wheeled my bag into the foyer. The house smelled like vanilla and lavender, the way it always did before a big event. My mother's way of making everything look perfect for guests. "Melissa's upstairs with the wedding planner," she said, already turning away. "Try not to bother her. She's extremely stressed." I nodded, even though she wasn't looking. I had heard some version of that sentence my entire life. Don't bother Melissa. Melissa needs quiet. Melissa is sensitive, as if I wasn't. That evening we gathered around the dining table for what my mother called a family dinner. It was just the four of us. My father sat at the head, barely looking up from his phone. My mother fussed over the roast chicken she'd made, serving Melissa the largest portion without asking. I got what was left. "Melissa, sweetheart, you look radiant," my mother said, reaching over to touch my sister's hand. "Ethan is so lucky. You're going to be the most beautiful bride." Melissa smiled, glancing at me as if to make sure I was watching. "Thanks, Mum." My mother turned to me, then her expression shifting. "Jennifer, you didn't bring anything nicer to wear." I looked down at my simple blouse and jeans. "I just got here, Mum. I'll change for the rehearsal dinner." "It's just that Melissa's friends are coming by later and I want everyone to see that our family has standards." She said it lightly, but the message was clear. I wasn't meeting them. My father finally looked up. "Leave her alone, Claire. She looks fine." It might have felt like support if he hadn't said it with the enthusiasm of someone commenting on the weather. My mother waved him off and returned her attention to Melissa, asking about flowers, seating charts, the cake. I sat there chewing quietly, waiting for the meal to end. Later, alone in my old bedroom, I found myself staring at the small wooden frame on the dresser. It held a photo of my grandmother. I'd kept it there since she passed 20 years ago. I was 13 then, and she'd been the only person in this house who ever made me feel like I mattered. I remembered her last words to me whispered in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and grief. She'd taken my hand, her skin papery and cold, and said, "When you turn 33, find Lawyer Morrison. He'll have something for you." I'd asked her what she meant, but she only smiled. "You'll understand when it's time." I never told anyone. At 13, it felt like a secret, something sacred between us. Now, at 32, a week away from 33, I wondered if she'd been delirious. But some part of me, the part that still ached for her kindness, hoped she hadn't been. I turned off the light and lay down on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, the chaos would begin in earnest. The dress fittings, the rehearsal, the endless reminders that this week belonged to Melissa. That night, I didn't know the real humiliation hadn't even begun. The next morning arrived with my mother's voice cutting through the bedroom door. "Jennifer, we need you downstairs, now." I checked my phone. It was 7:30. The rehearsal wasn't until 4. I pulled on a sweater and jeans and made my way to the kitchen, where my mother stood with a clipboard and Melissa sat at the table, scrolling through her phone, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. "Good, you're up," my mother said without looking at me. "I'm putting you in charge of the guest book table and the favour bags. Simple tasks. Nothing that requires too much attention." She handed me a list. "And, Jennifer, I need you to understand something. This week is about Melissa, every single moment. So please don't try to steal her spotlight." I blinked at her. "I wasn't planning to. I'm just saying you have a tendency to draw attention to yourself. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but people notice you, and this week that can't happen. All eyes need to be on the bride." She said it as if it were a reasonable request, as if asking me to become invisible for 5 days was the same as asking me to pass the salt. My father walked in then, pouring himself coffee. He glanced at me and chuckled. "You always find a way to stand out, Jen, even when you're trying not to." He said it like a joke, but it landed like an accusation. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I hadn't done anything. I'd barely spoken since I arrived, but I knew better than to argue. Melissa finally looked up from her phone. "Just don't wear anything too bright, okay? The bridesmaids are in blush pink, and I don't want you clashing in the photos." I wasn't even in the wedding party. I was a guest at my own sister's wedding, but I nodded anyway. Later that afternoon, I sat with my mother's ancient desktop computer in the study, organising the seating chart she'd printed out. My phone buzzed, a reminder from my loan servicer. Another payment due. I opened the app and stared at the balance. $40,000. Still, after 14 years of payments interest piling on every month, I'd barely made a dent. I'd graduated with $60,000 in debt because my parents told me there was no money for college. I worked 3 jobs my freshman year just to cover books and rent. I remembered calling home exhausted and broke, asking if they could help with even $100. My mother had sighed and said, "Jennifer, we're already stretched thin. You'll have to manage." But 2 years later, when Melissa turned 18, they threw her a graduation party that cost more than my entire first semester. When she enrolled in the same state school I'd gone to, they paid her tuition in full. No loans, no side jobs. She studied abroad in France the summer after her sophomore year. I'd asked once how they could suddenly afford it, and my mother had looked at me coolly and said, "We made sacrifices for you too, Jennifer. Be grateful we let you go to college at all." I closed the loan app and tried to focus on the seating chart, but my mind drifted backward. I was 15 again, standing in the kitchen, after school, my backpack heavy with textbooks. I just told my parents I wanted to take an SAT prep course. It cost $200. My mother shook her head. "We don't have that kind of money lying around. You'll have to study on your own." I took a job washing dishes at a diner 4 nights a week. I bought used prep books and studied in the back during my breaks, my hands red and raw from scalding water. That same year, Melissa turned 11. For her birthday, my parents bought her the new iPhone, not the cheap model, the expensive one. I watched her tear open the box, squealing with delight while I stood in the doorway, wearing my grease-stained work shirt. My mother caught my expression and said, "Don't look at her like that. She's younger. She deserves to enjoy her childhood." The memory shifted. I was 20 home for Thanksgiving my sophomore year. I'd taken the bus because I couldn't afford gas. When I walked in, my mother told me they'd decided to keep the holiday small that year. Just the three of them. You understand, don't you? It's less stressful this way. I ate a frozen dinner alone in my dorm room while my roommate was gone. I saw the photos later on Facebook. My parents, Melissa, and a table full of family friends I'd grown up with. The caption read, "Grateful for family." When Melissa turned 16, they rented out a venue and hired a DJ. 100 people came. There was a chocolate fountain and a photo booth and a slideshow of her childhood. I wasn't in a single picture. I'd been cropped out or simply not included. I stood in the corner that night smiling when people looked at me, wondering what I'd done to deserve being erased. Now sitting in that study, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. It wasn't just the wedding. It was a lifetime of being told I was less important, less valuable, less worth celebrating, and I'd accepted it because I didn't know I had any other choice. My mother appeared in the doorway. "Are you done with the seating chart?" I nodded and handed it to her. She glanced at it and frowned. "You put yourself at table 12. That's too close to the head table. Move yourself to 15. Table 15 was in the back corner near the kitchen doors. I took the paper back and made the change without a word. That evening, Melissa tried on her wedding dress in the living room, while my mother and two of her friends cooed and took pictures. I was in the hallway folding programs when Melissa called out, "Jennifer, can you come here for a second?" I stepped into the room. She was standing on a small platform in front of the mirror, the dress shimmering under the overhead light. She looked beautiful. I told her so. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Stand next to me," she said. I did. She looked at me in the mirror, then at my mother. "See? This is what I was worried about. She's too pretty. Even in jeans and a sweater, she pulls focus." My mother studied us, both lips pressed together. "We'll figure it out," she said. I stepped back, my face burning. No one said anything else. I returned to the hallway and finished folding the programs in silence, my hands shaking slightly. I told myself it didn't matter. One more week. Then I could leave and go back to my small apartment and my quiet life where no one compared me to anyone or found me lacking. I could survive one more week. But the next morning, they took things even further. I woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. Multiple voices. The wedding planner maybe, or the florist. I checked my phone. 8 in the morning. 3 days until the wedding. I dragged myself out of bed and pulled on the same jeans from yesterday, too tired to care. Downstairs, the house had transformed into a command centre. There were boxes stacked in the hallway, garment bags draped over the couch, and my mother standing in the middle of it all with her clipboard directing traffic. A woman I didn't recognise was measuring the archway in the living room. Another was unloading crystal vases from a crate. "Jennifer," my mother said the moment she saw me. "Perfect timing. I need you to take these favour boxes to the venue and make sure they're stored properly. Then come back and help label the place cards. The calligrapher made a mistake on 6 of them." She handed me a stack of small white boxes tied with ribbon, not waiting for a response. I loaded them into my car and drove to the country club, where the reception would be held. It took me an hour to unload everything and confirm with the event coordinator where they'd be placed. When I returned home, my mother handed me a list of names and a gold pen. I sat at the dining table, carefully writing out place cards in my neatest handwriting, while around me the house buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with me. Melissa's fiancé Ethan arrived just before noon. I'd met him twice before, both times briefly. He was tall, clean-cut, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a cologne ad. He worked in finance, I think, or consulting. Something that required expensive suits. He carried in a box of wine bottles, setting them on the kitchen counter, and when he turned and saw me at the table, he paused. "Jennifer," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't place. Recognition, maybe, or hesitation. "It's good to see you again." "You too, you too," I said, looking back down at the place cards. He lingered for a moment like he wanted to say something else, but Melissa appeared in the doorway, and his attention shifted immediately. "Babe, come look at the seating chart," she said, taking his hand. He followed her into the living room, but I caught him glancing back at me just once before disappearing around the corner. It was strange. Not inappropriate, just awkward, like he wasn't sure how to act around me. Later that afternoon, my mother told me it was time to try on my dress. I wasn't in the wedding party, but I was expected to wear something specific for the family photos. She led me upstairs to Melissa's room, where a blush pink dress hung on the closet door. It was simple, modest, the kind of dress that would blend into the background. I changed in the bathroom and came out to find my mother and Melissa waiting. My mother walked a slow circle around me, examining every angle. "It fits well," she said. Then her eyes moved to my hair. I'd worn it down that day, loose waves falling past my shoulders. It was naturally a light auburn, catches of gold in the sun. My grandmother used to say it was my best feature. "This won't work," my mother said, frowning. She reached out and lifted a section of my hair, letting it fall through her fingers. "It's too bright. You'll outshine the bride in the photos." I stared at her. "It's just my hair, Mom." "I'm not saying it's your fault," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But we need to think about the overall aesthetic. Melissa's hair is darker. Yours catches too much light. It draws the eye." Melissa stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding in agreement. "I've been thinking the same thing. In that dress with your hair like that, you're going to stand out in every picture." I didn't know what to say. It felt absurd. I was being criticised for the colour of my hair, something I had no control over. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice flat. "We'll figure something out." My mother said the same phrase she'd used the night before. "Maybe a darker rinse, or we could style it back, keep it tight and out of the way." She said it so casually, as if she were suggesting a different shade of lipstick. I changed back into my jeans and left the dress hanging in Melissa's room. As I walked past the hallway, I saw Ethan standing near the window, phone in hand. He looked up when I passed, and again that strange expression crossed his face. Not pity, exactly. Something closer to discomfort. "Hey," he said, stepping toward me. "You okay?" I wasn't sure how to answer that. "I'm fine." He nodded slowly, but he didn't look convinced. "Listen, if you need anything this week, let me know. I know wedding stuff can be overwhelming." It was a kind gesture, but it felt out of place. We barely knew each other. Still, I appreciated it. "Thanks," I said. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, then seemed to think better of it. He returned to his phone, and I continued down the stairs. That evening, the house finally quieted. The vendors had left, Melissa was out with friends, and my father was in his study. I found my mother in the kitchen washing dishes. I stood in the doorway for a moment watching her. She looked tired, older than I remembered. "Mum," I said, and she glanced over her shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" "What is it?" "Grandma's house, this house, she left it to the family, right?" My mother's hand stilled in the soapy water. "Yes? Weißt du why?" "I was just wondering. I don't remember much about the will or anything. I was only 13 when she died." She turned off the faucet and dried her hands on a towel, her expression unreadable. "Your grandmother left everything to the family. The house, some savings. It's how we've been able to live comfortably all these years." She said it matter-of-factly, like it was common knowledge. "Why are you asking?" "No reason," I said. "Just curious." She studied me for a moment, then turned back to the sink. "Don't go digging up the past, Jennifer. It doesn't do anyone any good." There was an edge in her voice sharp enough to make me drop it. I left the kitchen and went back to my room, my mind turning over her words. The family. That's what she'd said. Not me, not Melissa. The family. I thought about my grandmother again, about what she'd told me in the hospital. "Find Lawyer Morrison when you're 33. It had seemed like nonsense at the time, a dying woman's confusion. But now, standing in this house where I'd never quite belonged, I wondered if she'd meant something specific. Something my mother didn't want me to know. The next morning, my mother knocked on my bedroom door earlier than usual. She didn't wait for me to answer before stepping inside. Melissa was with her, and they both had the same determined look on their faces. "We've made a decision," my mother said. "About your hair." I sat up slowly, dread settling into my stomach. They said they needed to fix my hair before the big day. I should have seen it coming. I should have recognised the look in my mother's eyes, the same look she'd had when she told me at 15 that I couldn't take the SAT prep course, or at 20 when she uninvited me from Thanksgiving. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision and wasn't interested in discussion. "It's just a trim," she said, her voice light, almost cheerful. "Nothing drastic. We're going to tone down the colour a bit and style it so it doesn't catch the light in photos. It'll be subtle. You won't even notice." Melissa stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding along. "It's really for the best, Jen. You'll still look nice. Just not, distracting." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them this was insane, that my hair was fine, that I had every right to look like myself at my own sister's wedding. But I was so tired. Tired of fighting for scraps of respect in this house. Tired of being made to feel like my existence was an inconvenience. So I just nodded. "Okay," I said quietly. "When?" "Now," my mother replied. "I've already called someone. She'll be here in 20 minutes. I blinked. "Now, Mom, it's 7 in the morning. "She's doing us a favour, Jennifer. Don't be ungrateful." My mother turned and walked out, Melissa following close behind. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, trying to process what was happening. A trim. That's all it was supposed to be. I told myself it would be fine. I'd go back to Columbus in a few days and never think about it again. The hairdresser arrived right on time. Her name was Diane, a woman in her 50s with short grey hair and a tired smile. She set up a folding chair in the kitchen, spreading a plastic cape over the back. My mother gestured for me to sit, and I did, letting Diane fasten the cape around my neck. "So what are we doing today?" Diane asked, running her fingers through my hair. "Just a trim and a darker tone," my mother said from behind me. "We want it understated, professional." Diane nodded and started combing through the tangles. I closed my eyes, trying to relax. I heard the sound of scissors, the familiar snip-snip of hair being cut. It wasn't so bad. I could handle this. Then I heard a different sound. A buzzing sound. Electric clippers. My eyes flew open. "Wait, what are you?" My mother's hands clamped down on my shoulders, firm and unyielding. "Don't move, Jennifer. You'll mess it up." "Mom, those are clippers. You said a trim." "This is a trim," she said, her voice hard now. "Sit still." I tried to stand, but her grip was too strong. Melissa appeared on my other side, holding my arm down against the chair. "Just let her finish," she said quietly. "It's easier if you don't fight." I felt the clippers touch the back of my neck, cold metal against my skin, and then the sensation of them moving upward. I felt my hair falling away in chunks, landing on the plastic cape, sliding onto the floor. I wanted to scream, to shove them both away and run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in that chair, watching in the reflection of the window as my hair disappeared. Diane worked quickly, methodically, her face carefully blank. She didn't look at me, didn't ask if I was okay. She just kept buzzing, row after row, until there was nothing left. My mother finally released my shoulders and stepped back. Melissa let go of my arm. I sat there trembling, unable to speak. "All done," Diane said softly. She unfastened the cape and brushed the loose hair off my neck. I still couldn't look, couldn't process what had just happened. My mother handed Diane an envelope, cash I assumed, and walked her to the door. I heard them exchange a few words, something about the weather, and then the door closed. My mother came back into the kitchen and stood in front of me. "Go look," she said. I didn't want to. I didn't want to see what they'd done. But I stood on shaking legs and walked to the bathroom, my hand trailing along the wall for balance. I pushed open the door and flipped on the light, and then I saw myself in the mirror. My head was completely bald, not trimmed, not styled, shaved clean, smooth as stone, every trace of my auburn hair gone. I looked like someone I didn't recognize. My scalp was pale, exposed, vulnerable. I reached up with a trembling hand and touched it, feeling the unfamiliar smoothness, and something inside me broke. I turned around. My mother was standing in the doorway watching me. Her expression was calm, almost satisfied. "Why?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" "You needed to be humbled," she said simply. "You've always thought you were special, Jennifer. Always drawing attention, always making everything about you. Melissa deserves her moment, and you were going to take it from her. Now you won't." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. "I never wanted attention. I never asked for any of this." "You didn't have to ask. You just are." She said it like it was a fact, something unchangeable and unfortunate. "Now you look humble. This is how it should be." She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in front of the mirror, staring at the stranger looking back at me. I heard Melissa's voice in the kitchen, asking if it was done, and my mother's response, satisfied and light. I heard my father's footsteps on the stairs, heard him pause when he saw me, heard him say nothing and keep walking. I locked the bathroom door and sank down onto the floor, my back against the tub, my hands covering my face. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. I just sat there numb, trying to understand how my own mother could do this to me, trying to understand what I had done to deserve it. But deep down, I knew. I'd spent my whole life being punished for existing, for being seen, for not disappearing the way they wanted me to. And now they'd found a way to make me invisible, to strip away the one thing my grandmother had once told me was beautiful. I stayed in that bathroom for an hour, maybe longer. When I finally came out, the house was quiet. I went to my room and closed the door, sat on the bed and stared at the wall. My phone buzzed with a text from a coworker asking how the wedding prep was going. I didn't answer. They didn't just shave my hair, they shaved off my trust. I stayed in my room for the rest of the morning, sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap. Every time I caught my reflection in the dresser mirror, I looked away. I didn't recognize the person staring back. The house moved around me, voices drifting up through the floorboards, footsteps in the hallway, the doorbell ringing as the more deliveries arrived. No one came to check on me, no one knocked. Around noon, I heard a soft tap at the door. I didn't answer, but it opened anyway. I expected my mother, or maybe Melissa, coming to justify what they had done. Instead, it was Ethan. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, his expression careful, like he was approaching something fragile. "Hey," he said quietly. I didn't respond. I just looked at him, waiting. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair by the window, keeping distance between us. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen from anyone else in this house. It looked like guilt. "I need to tell you something," he finally said, "and I don't know if it'll make this better or worse, but you deserve to know." I felt my stomach tighten. "What?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. "A week ago, Melissa showed me pictures of you. Recent ones from your social media. She was upset. She kept saying you were too pretty, that she couldn't compete, that everyone would be looking at you instead of her during the wedding." He paused, meeting my eyes. "She sent those same photos to your mother. I saw the text thread. She told her, 'Jennifer's going to ruin my day. We have to do something.'" The words landed like stones, heavy and cold. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Melissa did this." "She pushed for it," Ethan said. "I don't know if your mother would have gone this far on her own, but Melissa kept insisting. She was terrified you'd outshine her. I heard her on the phone with your mum 2 days ago saying, 'Just cut it. All of it. She won't stop us.'" He looked down at his hands. "I should have said something. I should have warned you. But I didn't think they'd actually do it." I thought it was just wedding stress, you know. People say crazy things when they're anxious. He shook his head. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I felt something crack open inside me, something deeper than shock or pain. It was betrayal, but not the kind I'd felt with my mother. This was different. Melissa was my little sister. I'd protected her when we were kids. Stood between her and our parents' arguments, let her borrow my clothes and my books and my time. I'd never competed with her, never resented the attention she got, because I thought that's what older sisters did. You made space for the people you loved, and she'd repaid me by orchestrating this. Why are you telling me? I asked, my voice rough. Because it's not right, Ethan said simply. What they did to you isn't right, and you should know who was behind it. He hesitated. I've been watching the way your family treats you. It's not just today, it's everything. The way your mum talks to you, the way they put you at the back table, the way they act like you're a problem that needs to be managed. I didn't understand it at first, but now I do. They're afraid of you. I almost laughed. Afraid of me. Not of you hurting them. Afraid of you existing. Afraid that if people look at you, they'll see what I see. He stood up and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. You're stronger than all of them, Jennifer. I don't think you know that yet, but you are. He left before I could respond, the door clicking softly shut behind him. I sat there, his words echoing in my head. Melissa had done this. My baby sister, the one I'd read bedtime stories to, the one I'd taught to ride a bike, had looked at me and decided I needed to be erased. And my mother had agreed. My father had walked past me without a word. They had all decided together that I was the problem, that my existence was too much, that I needed to be cut down to size. I thought about all the years I'd spent making myself smaller, turning down opportunities so I wouldn't outpace Melissa, keeping quiet when my parents praised her and ignored me, accepting the back table, the menial tasks, the constant criticism, because I thought that's what family required. Sacrifice, patience, understanding. I'd given them everything, and they'd given me nothing in return, except the message that I was too much and not enough at the same time. But Ethan was right about one thing. This wasn't just about hair. It was about power, about control, about a lifetime of being told to dim my light so someone else could shine. And I was done. I stood up and walked to the mirror, forcing myself to look. My bald head, my exposed scalp, the rawness of it. They'd meant it as a punishment, a humiliation, a way to strip me of the one thing they thought gave me value. But as I stared at my reflection, I realised something. They hadn't taken my value. They'd only revealed their own fear. I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to hide in this room for the next 3 days and let them pretend I didn't exist. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Instead, I was going to show them exactly who I was. Not the lesser daughter, not the problem, not the girl who needed to be humbled. I was going to walk into that wedding and let everyone see what they'd done. And more importantly, I was going to start asking the questions they didn't want me to ask. Like why my grandmother told me to find a lawyer when I turned 33. Like what she meant when she said he'd have something for me. Like why my mother's face had gone cold when I asked about the will. They wanted me invisible, voiceless, powerless. But invisible people see things others don't. Invisible people hear the conversations no one thinks they're listening to. And I'd been invisible in this house for 32 years. I'd seen plenty. I pulled out my phone and opened my browser, typing in the name I'd carried in the back of my mind for 2 decades. Lawyer Morrison, Ohio. A dozen results came up, but one stood out. Morrison and Associates, Estate Planning and Probate Law, located 20 minutes from here. I stared at the address, my grandmother's voice echoing in my memory. When you turn 33, find him. My birthday was in 5 days. Maybe she hadn't been delirious after all. I saved the address and put my phone back in my pocket. Then I opened my suitcase and pulled out the nicest outfit I'd brought, a simple black dress I'd planned to wear to the rehearsal dinner. I was done hiding, done shrinking, done letting them decide who I was allowed to be. If they wanted me invisible, I'd show them what invisible can do. I needed help, and I knew exactly who to call. Clara Mendoza had been my roommate in college back when I still believed hard work and talent could overcome anything. She'd gone on to become one of the most sought-after stylists in Cleveland, working with news anchors, executives, and anyone who needed to look powerful on camera. We'd stayed in touch over the years, though we hadn't seen each other in months. I pulled out my phone and dialed her number before I could second-guess myself. She picked up on the third ring. "Jennifer Brooks, it's been forever. What's going on?" "Clara, I need your help." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I'm at my parents' house for my sister's wedding and something happened. Something bad." There was a pause. "Are you okay?" "No," I said honestly, "but I will be. Can you come here? I know it's a lot to ask, but I need someone I can trust, and you're the only person I can think of." "Text me the address, go shoot," she said immediately. "I'll be there in 2 hours." I sent her the information and felt the first flicker of something that wasn't despair. I had an ally now, someone who wasn't part of this family's twisted dynamic, someone who might actually be on my side. I sat back down on the bed and waited, trying to gather my thoughts when I heard voices downstairs. One of them was unfamiliar, older, commanding in a way that made people stop talking. I cracked open my door and listened. "Where is she with Iowa, eh?" the voice demanded. "Helen, this isn't a good time," my mother said, her tone tight with irritation. "We're in the middle of wedding preparations." "I don't care about the wedding, Claire. I care about my niece. Now where is Jennifer?" My heart jumped. Aunt Helen. I hadn't seen her in years, not since my grandmother's funeral. She was my grandmother's younger sister, a woman who'd never married, never had children, and had spent her life travelling and doing exactly what she pleased. My mother had always resented her, called her selfish and irresponsible, but my grandmother had loved her fiercely. I heard footsteps on the stairs, quick and determined, and then Helen was standing in my doorway. She was in her 70s now, her silver hair cut short, her face lined but sharp. She took one look at me and her expression darkened. "My God," she whispered. "What did they do to you?" I stood up suddenly, self-conscious. "It's just hair. It'll grow back." "Don't," she said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "Don't minimize this. I know what your mother is capable of, Jennifer. I've watched her do this to you your entire life." She crossed the room and put her hands on my shoulders, looking me straight in the eyes. "Your grandmother saw it too. That's why she made sure you'd have a way out." I stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Helen glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. "Your grandmother left you something important, something your mother doesn't want you to know about. She told me before she died that when you turned 33, you needed to find Lawyer Morrison. He has documents, a will, things that belong to you." She squeezed my shoulders gently. "You're almost 33, aren't you?" 5 days, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My birthday is in 5 days." "Then you don't have much time," Helen said. "Your mother knows. That's why she's been so desperate to keep you under control. That's why this..." She gestured to my shaved head. "They're trying to break you before you find out the truth." I felt the ground shift beneath me. What truth? What did my grandmother leave me? "I don't know all the details," Helen admitted. "She kept it quiet even from me, but I know it was substantial, enough to change your life, enough to make you independent of this family forever." She let go of my shoulders and stepped back. "I came as soon as I heard about the wedding. I had a feeling your mother would pull something, but I didn't think it would be this cruel." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my mother standing there, her face tight with false politeness. "Helen, I think it's time you left. Jennifer needs to rest." "Jennifer needs to get as far away from you as possible," Helen said coolly. "But I'll leave. I'm staying at the Marriott downtown." She turned to me. "Call me if you need anything, and Jennifer, go see that lawyer. Don't wait." She brushed past my mother and disappeared down the stairs. My mother lingered in the doorway, her eyes cold. "Your aunt has always been dramatic. Don't listen to her nonsense." She left without waiting for a response, and I stood there, my mind racing. Substantial, independent, a way out. I pulled out my phone again and looked at the address I'd saved earlier. Morrison and Associates. 5 days until my birthday. 5 days until whatever my grandmother had left me would be revealed. 2 hours later, Clara arrived. I met her at the door before my mother could intercept her, and we went straight to my room. When she saw me, her professional mask slipped for just a moment, shock and anger flashing across her face. Then she composed herself and set down the large bag she'd brought. "Okay," she said, all business now. "Tell me everything." I told her about the forced shaving, about Melissa's jealousy, about Ethan's confession, and Aunt Helen's revelation. Clara listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with each detail. When I finished, she opened her bag and started pulling out products, brushes, cases of makeup. "Here's what we're going to do," she said. "You're going to that wedding and you're going to look stunning. Not despite the shaved head. Because of it. We're going to make it a statement, not a shame. Confidence, elegance, power. They wanted to humiliate you, so we're going to show them they failed." She spent the next hour working on me, shaping and smoothing, applying products I'd never heard of, teaching me how to hold my head high and own the look they'd forced on me. When she finally turned me toward the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My scalp was polished and smooth, catching the light. She'd done my makeup in a way that made my eyes look striking, dramatic. I looked strong. I looked defiant. "There," Clara said softly. "That's who you really are." I stared at my reflection, and for the first time since this morning, I felt something other than grief. I felt anger, clean and focused. They'd tried to make me disappear, and instead, they'd stripped away everything I'd been hiding behind. No more polite smiles. No more making myself small. I was visible now, whether they liked it or not. Clara packed up her things and hugged me before she left. "You call me if you need anything else. And I mean anything." I promised I would, and after she was gone, I sat on the bed with my phone in my hand, thinking about everything Aunt Helen had said. A will, documents, something substantial, something my mother wanted to keep from me. I thought about the way she'd shut me down when I asked about my grandmother's estate, the edge in her voice when she said not to dig up the past. But I was going to dig. I was going to find out exactly what they had been hiding from me for 20 years. I was going to walk into that wedding looking like someone they couldn't ignore. And then I was going to take back everything they'd stolen. But my revenge wouldn't stop at a new look. That evening, after the house had settled into an uneasy quiet, I heard another knock at my door. I'd been sitting at the small desk by the other window, making notes on my phone about everything Aunt Helen had told me, cross-referencing it with what little I remembered about my grandmother's death. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere private?" I glanced down the hallway. My parents' bedroom door was closed, a strip of light visible underneath. Melissa was out with her bridesmaids at some kind of spa event. I nodded and grabbed a jacket, following Ethan down the stairs and out the back door. We walked across the lawn to the old wooden bench near the property line, far enough from the house that no one could overhear us. We sat in silence for a moment, the cool evening air settling around us. Ethan stared out at the darkening sky, his jaw tight like he was working up the courage to say something difficult. "There's something I need to tell you," he finally said. "Something I should have told you the moment I walked into this house and saw you again." I waited, my heart beating a little faster. "We knew each other before," he said. 7 years ago. You probably don't remember. It was brief. But I did remember. The memory hit me all at once, something I'd buried so deep, I'd almost convinced myself it hadn't mattered. 7 years ago, I'd been 25, working my first real job in Columbus, still hopeful that life might turn out differently than my childhood had suggested. I'd met him at a coffee shop near my office. We talked for an hour, exchanged numbers, started seeing each other. It had been easy and uncomplicated, the kind of relationship that felt like it might actually go somewhere. "I remember," I said quietly. He looked at me, then relief and regret mixing in his expression. "We dated for 3 months, and then I got the job offer in Chicago. I asked you to come with me, and you said no. I couldn't leave." I said, the old justification rising automatically. "I'd just started my job. My lease wasn't up, it was too soon." "I know," he said, and I understood. But I left anyway, and we lost touch. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. 2 years later, I moved back to Ohio. I was at a charity event in Cleveland, and Melissa was there. She introduced herself, said her sister had gone to the same college I did. I didn't make the connection at first. Brooks is a common name. But then she showed me a family photo on her phone, and there you were. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "You knew who she was when you started dating her." "Not at first," he said quickly. "Not that night, but a few weeks in I figured it out, and by then I'd already—" He trailed off, shaking his head. I told myself it didn't matter, that what we had was in the past, that you'd moved on, and so had I. Melissa was sweet and charming, and she made me feel wanted. I convinced myself it was fine. "Does she know?" I asked. "Does she know you and I were together?" "No," he said. "I never told her. I didn't think it mattered. But now, being here, seeing the way she treats you, the way your whole family treats you, I realise it does matter. Because she's not the person I thought she was. And this family is not what it seemed." I looked at him, trying to reconcile the man sitting beside me with the person I'd known 7 years ago. He'd been kind back then. Thoughtful, the kind of person who listened when you talked. But he'd also been willing to walk away when things got complicated. And now, he was marrying my sister, the same sister who'd just orchestrated having my head shaved because she was jealous. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I owe you the truth," he said, "and because I think something else is going on here, something bigger than wedding drama." He turned to face me fully. "I've been paying attention these past few days. The way your mother talks about money, the way your father avoids certain conversations. I'm in finance, Jennifer. I know what evasion looks like. And when your Aunt Helen showed up today talking about wills and lawyers, I started putting pieces together." "What pieces?" "Your mother told Melissa that your grandmother left everything to the family. But Helen said your grandmother left something specifically to you. That's not the same thing." He ran a hand through his hair. So I started looking. "I have access to some public records through my work. I pulled up your grandmother's probate case from 20 years ago. My pulse quickened. "And it was sealed," he said. "The whole file. That almost never happens unless there's a dispute or someone petitions the court for privacy, which means someone didn't want that will to be public knowledge." He met my eyes. "I think your parents have been hiding something from you, something significant. And I think whatever your grandmother left you, they've been keeping it from you for 2 decades. I felt the world tilt slightly. Aunt Helen had hinted at the same thing, but hearing it from Ethan, hearing it backed up with legal terms and evidence, made it real. "Can you find out what's in the file?" "I'm trying," he said. "But it's complicated. I'd need a court order or someone with direct legal standing. You'd have standing once you turn 33 if your grandmother named you in the will. But until then, the records are locked." 5 days, I said. "I turn 33 in 5 days." He nodded slowly. "That's not a coincidence, is it? The timing of this wedding, the way they've been treating you. They're trying to keep you distracted, keep you from asking questions until after Melissa and I are married and out of here. Once we're gone, they probably think you'll just let it go. But they were wrong. I wasn't letting anything go. Not anymore. I thought about my mother's face when I'd asked about the house, the sharp edge in her voice when she told me not to dig up the past. I thought about the way my father had walked past me this morning without a word, as if I were invisible. They'd been hiding something, and they'd been willing to do anything to keep me from finding it. "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked. "I'm going to find out the truth," I said. "I'm going to see that lawyer the day of my birthday, and I'm going to get those records. And if my family has been lying to me, if they've been stealing from me, I'm going to make sure everyone knows." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll help you, whatever you need. I'll find what I can." "Why?" I asked. "You're marrying Melissa. You're about to become part of this family." "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I never should have let you go 7 years ago. I made a mistake. A lot of mistakes. But I can at least try to make this one right." He stood up, offering me his hand. I took it, letting him pull me to my feet. We stood there for a moment, close enough that I could see the conflict in his eyes, the guilt and the determination, and something else I couldn't quite name. When he looked at me, I saw the man who once loved me and feared the truth he was about to find. The morning of the wedding, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window and the distant sound of caterers setting up downstairs. Today was my 33rd birthday. No one in this house had mentioned it. Not my mother, not my father, not Melissa. It had been deliberately ignored, buried under the weight of wedding preparations, as if acknowledging it might give me some kind of power they weren't willing to concede. But I knew what today meant. I knew what it could mean. And I was ready. Clara had come back the night before with the dress we'd chosen together. It was nothing like the modest blush pink thing my mother had picked out for me. This was a floor-length gown in deep emerald silk, elegant and striking with a high neckline, and long sleeves that made it look timeless rather than trendy. It wasn't loud or attention-seeking. It was simply beautiful, and paired with my shaved head polished and gleaming under the lights Clara had taught me to use, it would make a statement I didn't need words to deliver. I took my time getting ready, moving through each step with deliberate precision. The makeup Clara had shown me how to apply, highlighting my eyes and cheekbones. The dress, sliding over my skin like water. The simple gold earrings that had been my grandmother's, the only jewellery I wore. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognised the woman staring back. She looked strong. She looked untouchable. She looked like someone who couldn't be diminished, no matter how hard you tried. I heard my mother calling for Melissa downstairs, her voice bright and cheerful, the voice she used when other people were listening. The ceremony was at 2, and guests would start arriving at the country club soon. I checked the time. 1:15. I picked up my small clutch, took one last look at my reflection and walked out of the room. The house was chaos. My father was adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror, muttering about cufflinks. My mother was on the phone with the florist, her tone sharp. Melissa stood in the living room in her wedding dress, a vision in white lace and tulle, her hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement of curls and flowers. She looked beautiful. She also looked tense, her jaw tight, her eyes darting toward the stairs every few seconds, as if she were waiting for something. When I appeared at the bottom of the staircase, the house went silent. My mother's phone call stopped mid-sentence. My father's hands froze on his collar. Melissa's eyes went wide, and I watched the colour drain from her face. For a long, suspended moment, no one spoke. They just stared. I walked past them, without a word, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. I didn't stop. I didn't explain. I simply picked up my purse from the hall table and walked out the front door to my car. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice low and urgent. "What is she wearing, Claire? What is she wearing?" But I didn't turn around. I got in my car and drove to the country club alone. When I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. I sat in my car for a moment, steadying my breathing, reminding myself why I was doing this. Not for revenge, not for attention, but because I refused to be erased. I refused to let them turn my humiliation into my shame. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, and as I did, I saw heads begin to turn. The ceremony was being held in the club's garden rows of white chairs arranged on either side of a flower-draped arbor. Guests were milling around, chatting in small clusters, glasses of champagne already in hand. I walked through the gate and down the stone path, and I felt the moment people noticed me. The conversations faltered, eyes widened, but instead of the pity or mockery I'd braced myself for, I saw something else. Surprise, curiosity, and then, slowly, admiration. An older woman I vaguely recognised as a friend of my mother's approached me, her expression warm. "My dear, you look absolutely radiant," she said, touching my arm gently. "That dress is stunning, and you're wearing it beautifully. What a bold choice." Another guest, a man in his 50s, nodded in agreement. "Elegant," he said simply. "Very elegant." I thanked them quietly and kept walking, moving toward the seats near the back where I'd been assigned. But as I passed, more people stopped me. Compliments followed in a steady stream, genuine and unrehearsed. "Gorgeous. So chic. You look like a model." No one mentioned my shaved head as if it were a tragedy. Instead, they treated it as a style, as a statement, something intentional and striking. Clara had been right. Confidence changed everything. I found my seat at table 15, tucked in the far corner near the catering entrance, exactly where my mother had placed me. I sat down and smoothed my dress, crossing my ankles, folding my hands in my lap. I didn't look around nervously. I didn't shrink. I simply sat calm and composed, a small smile playing at the corners of my mouth. That's when I saw my mother. She was standing near the front, speaking with the wedding planner, but her eyes were fixed on me. Her face was frozen in an expression I'd never seen before, something caught between fury and disbelief. She said something sharp to the planner and started walking toward me, her steps quick and purposeful. But before she reached me, someone else intercepted her, an aunt or cousin pulling her into conversation. She glanced back at me, her jaw set, but she couldn't break away without causing a scene. Melissa appeared a moment later, flanked by her bridesmaids. She was supposed to be sequestered away somewhere, maintaining the illusion of bridal mystery until the ceremony began, but she'd clearly heard I'd arrived. She stood at the edge of the garden, partially hidden behind a trellis, staring at me. I met her gaze calmly, still smiling, and watched as something shifted in her expression. The careful composure she'd worn all week began to crack. Her hands clenched at her sides. One of the bridesmaids whispered something to her, but she didn't seem to hear. The string quartet began playing, signalling that the ceremony was about to start. Guests moved toward their seats. My mother hurried to the front row, her face tight. Melissa disappeared back toward the bridal suite, but not before shooting me one last look, this one filled with something I couldn't quite name. Panic, maybe, or rage. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded, my expression serene. People were still glancing at me, still whispering, but the tone wasn't cruel. It was curious, impressed even. I'd walked into this place expecting to be a spectacle of humiliation, and instead I'd become something else entirely. I'd become someone they couldn't ignore and couldn't look away from. The music swelled. The officiant took his place under the arbor. The bridesmaids began their processional moving down the aisle in perfect formation. And then Melissa appeared at the far end of the garden, her arm linked through my father's, her veil covering her face. She should have looked radiant. She should have looked like the happiest woman in the world. But even from a distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in her walk. She reached the arbor. My father kissed her cheek and took his seat beside my mother. The officiant began speaking, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. But Melissa wasn't looking at Ethan. She was looking past him, her eyes searching the rows of guests until they landed on me. And that's when Melissa lost control. She didn't say her vows. She didn't smile at Ethan or acknowledge the officiant's words. Instead, Melissa turned away from the arbor, her white dress sweeping across the grass, and stared directly at me. The officiant faltered mid-sentence, confused, glancing between the bride and groom. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks to see what was happening. "You," Melissa said, her voice cutting through the confused silence. She lifted one shaking hand and pointed at me. "You couldn't just let me have this one day, could you?" The murmur grew louder. My mother rose, halfway out of her seat, her face pale. My father grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. Ethan stepped toward Melissa, reaching for her hand, but she jerked away from him. "Melissa," he said quietly, urgently. "Not now. Please." But she wasn't listening. She gathered her skirt in both hands and walked down the aisle. Her eyes locked on mine, her face twisted with something that looked like panic and rage mixed together. Guests turned in their seats watching her pass, their expressions ranging from shock to fascination. The bridesmaid stood frozen at the front, unsure whether to follow. The flower girl started crying. Melissa stopped a few feet from my table, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling beneath the lace bodice of her dress. "You did this on purpose," she hissed. "You couldn't stand that today was about me, so you had to make yourself the center of attention, like you always do." I stayed seated, my hands still folded in my lap, my expression calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I simply looked at her and said, "I didn't do anything, Melissa. I'm just sitting here." "You're wearing that," she spat, gesturing at my dress. "And your head. You're trying to make everyone look at you instead of me. You're trying to ruin my wedding." Around us, the whispers intensified. I could hear fragments of conversation, people trying to piece together what was happening. What's going on? Did something happen between them? Why is the bride upset? An older woman near the front whispered loudly to her companion, "I thought the sister looked lovely. What's the problem?" I took a slow breath and met Melissa's eyes. "I didn't ruin your day, Melissa. You did." Her face went white, then red. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about." I said, my voice steady and clear enough that people nearby could hear. "You orchestrated what happened to me. You sent those photos to Mum. You told her I was too pretty, that I'd ruin your wedding, that something had to be done. And she did it, for you." The garden went completely silent. Even the breeze seemed to still. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around wildly as if searching for support, but everyone was watching her now, waiting for her to deny it or explain. My mother stood up again this time, managing to pull free from my father's grip. "That's enough, Jennifer," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. "You're making a scene. This is Melissa's wedding and you need to leave. Now." I finally stood, slowly smoothing my dress. I was taller than Melissa, and in heels I had several inches on her. I didn't move toward her or make any threatening gesture. I simply stood there looking down at my little sister, the golden child, the one who'd been protected and coddled and given everything while I'd been expected to disappear. "I'm not leaving," I said quietly. "I was invited to this wedding. I'm family, remember? Or does that only count when it's convenient for you?" Melissa's eyes filled with tears, but they looked more like tears of frustration than sadness. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "You've always been the pretty one, the smart one. Everyone always noticed you, even when you weren't trying. I just wanted one day where I was the most important person in the room. Just one day." "So you had them shave my head," I said, and the words hung in the air like an accusation. More gasps from the crowd. People were pulling out their phones now, some of them discreetly recording. This was going to be all over social media before the reception even started. My mother looked like she might faint. Melissa shook her head frantically. "That's not what happened. You're twisting everything." "Am I?" I looked past her at my mother, who stood frozen at the front of the aisle. Mom, do you want to tell everyone what happened 3 days ago? How you held me down in a chair while someone shaved my head because you were afraid I'd outshine the bride? How you told me I needed to be humbled?" My mother's face went from pale to crimson. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My father stood beside her, looking at the ground, his hands clenched at his sides. The guests were whispering frantically now, the sound building like a wave. I heard someone say, "They shaved her head." Another voice, older and shocked, said, "That can't be true. Can it?" Ethan moved, then stepping off the arbor and walking down the aisle toward us. His face was set in an expression I'd never seen before, something hard and determined. He stopped beside Melissa, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made my breath catch. Respect, admiration, and something deeper, something that looked like solidarity. "It's true," he said, his voice carrying across the silent garden. "I witnessed part of it. I saw what they did to her. And I should have stopped it, but I didn't. That's on me." He turned to Melissa, his expression softening slightly. "But Jennifer's right. She didn't ruin your wedding. You did. The moment you decided she was a threat instead of your sister." Melissa stared at him, her mouth open in disbelief. "Ethan, you're supposed to be on my side." "So I am on the side of what's right," he said quietly. "And this isn't it." The maid of honor finally moved, hurrying down the aisle to take Melissa's arm. "Come on, honey. Let's go inside. Let's fix your makeup and take a breath." She tried to guide Melissa away, but my sister pulled back, her eyes still on me, wild and desperate. "This is your fault," she said, her voice rising to a near shout. "All of it. You've always ruined everything. You've always made me feel like I wasn't enough." "No," I said, and my voice was calm, almost gentle. "You did that to yourself. I never competed with you, Melissa. I never tried to take anything from you. But you convinced yourself I was the enemy, and Mum and Dad let you believe it. They encouraged it. And now, here we are." I picked up my clutch from the table and walked past her, past Ethan, past my frozen parents, and up the aisle toward the exit. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. They just watched me go, their faces, a mixture of shock and sympathy and, in some cases, respect. As I reached the gate, I heard Melissa burst into sobs behind me, heard my mother's voice trying to calm her, heard the chaos erupting as 100 guests tried to process what they had just witnessed. I didn't look back. I walked to my car, got in and sat there for a moment, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I'd done it. I'd stood up to them in front of everyone. I'd told the truth. And I hadn't broken. But the real storm was only beginning. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, watching guests stream out of the garden in confused clusters, their voices carrying across the asphalt. Some looked angry, others looked concerned. A few were openly laughing, phones still in hand, already sharing what they'd witnessed. I saw Aunt Helen emerge from the crowd, her silver hair unmistakable, scanning the parking lot until she spotted my car. She walked over and tapped on the window. I rolled it down. "That was quite a performance," she said, and I couldn't tell if she approved or not. "I didn't plan it," I said. "She came at me. I just told the truth." Helen nodded slowly. "The truth has a way of exploding when it's been buried too long. Your mother is in there trying to control the damage, spinning stories, telling anyone who'll listen that you've always been difficult, that you're jealous of Melissa, that this is some kind of mental breakdown." She leaned closer. "Don't let her rewrite what just happened. You stood up for yourself. Don't you dare apologize for it." "I won't," I said, and I meant it. "Good." She straightened up. "Now get out of here before your mother comes looking for you. And remember what I told you. Go see that lawyer. Today, if you can." She patted the roof of my car and walked away, disappearing back into the chaos. I started the engine and drove back to the house, my heart pounding the entire way. I didn't know what I'd find when I got there. Part of me expected my parents to be right behind me, ready to throw me out. But when I pulled into the driveway, the house was empty and quiet, exactly as we'd left it that morning. They were still at the country club, probably trying to salvage what was left of the ceremony. I let myself in through the front door and went straight to my room. My suitcase was still open on the floor, half packed. I started throwing the rest of my clothes into it, moving quickly, wanting to be gone before anyone came back. I was zipping it closed when I heard the sound of tyres on gravel. I looked out the window and saw my father's car pulling up. He got out alone, his tie loosened his face, set in an expression I recognised from childhood. It was the look he wore when he was about to deliver a punishment. I met him at the bottom of the stairs. He stood in the foyer, hands in his pockets, looking at me with something that might have been disappointment or might have been disgust. It was hard to tell with him. "You couldn't just let it go," he said. "You had to make a scene. You had to humiliate your sister in front of everyone." "I didn't humiliate her," I said. "She humiliated herself, and you let it happen. You all let it happen." "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice low and hard. "Your mother is over there trying to explain to 100 people why her daughter is unstable. Melissa is hysterical. The wedding is postponed. Ethan's parents are threatening to leave. You've destroyed this family." "This family destroyed itself a long time ago," I said. "I just finally stopped pretending otherwise." He took a step toward me, and for a moment I thought he might actually lose control. But he stopped, his jaw working, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You'll regret this, Jennifer. You think you've won something today, but you haven't. You've just made yourself an enemy of the people who raised you, who fed you, who gave you a home. And when you're alone and you have no one, you'll remember this moment and wish you'd kept your mouth shut." "I already know what it's like to be alone," I said quietly. "I've been alone my entire life in this house. The only difference now is that I'm finally telling the truth about it." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back out the door without another word. I heard his car start, heard the gravel crunch as he backed out of the driveway, and then the house was silent again. I stood there shaking, trying to process what had just happened. He'd threatened me. My own father had looked me in the eye and told me I'd regret standing up for myself. And some part of me, the part that had spent 33 years trying to earn his approval, wanted to run after him and apologise. But I didn't. I went back upstairs and finished packing. I was carrying my suitcase down to the car when I saw the mail truck pulling away from the mailbox at the end of the driveway. I almost ignored it, almost got in my car and drove away without looking back. But something made me walk down to the mailbox and open it. Inside was a single envelope, cream-coloured and formal, addressed to me in elegant script. The return address read Morrison and Associates Attorneys at Law. My hands went numb. I stood there at the end of the driveway staring at the envelope, my grandmother's voice echoing in my memory. "When you turn 33, find lawyer Morrison. Today was my 33rd birthday." And here it was, exactly as she'd promised, arriving on the one day she'd told me to expect it. I walked back to the house and sat down on the front steps, turning the envelope over in my hands. It was sealed with old-fashioned wax, the kind you didn't see anymore, stamped with the initials M and A. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper folded in thirds. I unfolded it and began to read. "Dear Miss Brooks," the letter began. "This correspondence is being sent to you on the occasion of your 33rd birthday, as per the instructions left by your grandmother Margaret Brooks upon her death 20 years ago. You are hereby informed that you are the primary beneficiary of a testamentary trust established by Mrs. Brooks in her last will and testament. The trust has reached its maturity date as of today, and you are entitled to receive full disclosure of its contents and distribution of all assets therein." I stopped reading, my vision blurring. A trust. My grandmother had left me a trust, and no one had told me. Not my mother, not my father, no one. I forced myself to keep reading. The trust consists of the following assets: the residential property located at 428 Oakwood Drive, valued at approximately $800,000, investment accounts totaling $1.7 million, and a designated education fund of $100,000 which was to be released upon your 18th birthday for college expenses. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange a meeting to discuss the terms of distribution and to sign the necessary documents. The paper fell from my hands. I sat there on the steps staring at nothing, trying to comprehend what I just read. My grandmother had left me everything. The house I'd grown up in, the house my parents had lived in for 20 years, wasn't theirs. It was mine. The money they'd used to pay for Melissa's college, for her parties, for her lavish wedding, that should have been mine too. The education fund that could have kept me from drowning in student loan debt had been sitting there the entire time, and they'd taken it. They'd stolen it. They'd stolen from me for 2 decades, and they'd lied to my face about it. I picked up the letter with shaking hands and read it again, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. But the words were clear. Primary beneficiary, full disclosure, assets. My grandmother had known. She'd known what my parents were like, known what they'd do if they had the chance. So she'd protected me the only way she could. She'd put everything in a trust and made sure I'd get it when I was old enough to fight for it, when I was 33. All those years I was never told the truth about what was mine. I sat on those steps for what felt like hours, the letter clutched in my hands, my mind racing through 20 years of memories, recontextualizing everything I'd ever known about my family. The letter had included additional documentation, several pages detailing the terms of the trust. And as I read through them, the full scope of what my grandmother had done and what my parents had hidden became devastatingly clear. The trust had been established the day my grandmother died. I'd been 13 years old, grieving the only person in that house who'd ever truly loved me. And while I'd cried in my room, my parents had been meeting with lawyers, signing documents that made them trustees of an estate worth millions. The terms were specific and protective. My grandmother had named me Jennifer Marie Brooks, first granddaughter, as the sole beneficiary. Everything she owned would be held in trust until my 33rd birthday, at which point full ownership would transfer to me, no exceptions, no conditions. But until that day, my parents had legal authority over the assets. They could live in the house. They could manage the investment accounts. They were entitled to reasonable compensation for their services as trustees, 2% annually, and they could use a portion of the income for my care and upbringing. The education fund was separate, earmarked specifically for my college expenses to be released when I turned 18. I did the math in my head. If they'd taken 2% of $2.5 million every year for 20 years, that was $1 million in fees alone, plus whatever they'd pulled from the investments under the guise of my care. Money for my food, my clothes, my school supplies, all of it coming from my trust, while they made me feel like a burden, like they were sacrificing to keep me fed and sheltered. And the education fund, $100,000 that should have paid for my entire college education, eliminated my debt, giving me the freedom to focus on my studies instead of working 3 jobs just to survive. They'd taken it. They'd used it for themselves, maybe for Melissa, maybe for their business or their lifestyle, and they'd let me drown in $60,000 of student loans while that money sat in an account with my name on it. I thought about calling home from college, desperate and exhausted, asking if they could help with even $100 for textbooks. My mother's voice, cool and dismissive, telling me I needed to learn to manage my money better, that they'd already done enough by raising me. I remembered the humiliation of that conversation, the shame I'd felt for even asking. And all the while, my college fund, the one my grandmother had set aside specifically to prevent that exact situation, had been sitting there and they'd kept it from me. But it was more than just the money. As the pieces fell into place, I began to see the pattern, the systematic way they'd controlled and sabotaged my life to keep me dependent and nearby. Because the trust had a condition. If I died before turning 33, everything would pass to the next granddaughter, Melissa. Which meant my parents had a vested interest in keeping me alive, but powerless, unable to discover the truth until it was too late to do anything about their 2 decades of theft. I thought about Michael. 4 years ago, when I was 28, I'd been engaged to a kind, decent man who'd wanted to build a life with me. We'd been planning a small wedding, nothing elaborate, just something simple and meaningful. And then, 2 weeks before the ceremony, he'd called it off via text message. I'd been devastated, confused, unable to understand what had gone wrong. I tried to reach him to talk, but he'd blocked my number and disappeared from my life completely. It wasn't until 2 years later that I'd run into him at a grocery store and he'd finally told me the truth. My mother had contacted him. She told him I had fertility issues, that I'd been hiding medical problems, that I came with debt and complications he couldn't imagine. She'd painted me as a liar and a liability, and he'd believed her, because why would a mother lie about her own daughter? He'd apologised when he learned the truth, told me he'd been young and stupid and scared. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. And now I understood why. My mother had needed to keep me single, isolated, dependent on the family. Because if I'd gotten married, Michael might have helped me look into my finances, might have discovered the trust, might have asked questions my mother couldn't answer. And then there was the job. 3 years ago, I'd been offered an incredible opportunity, a 6-month training program overseas that would have led to a major promotion and a significant salary increase. I'd been so excited, had already started making arrangements, when my mother called in hysterics. "Your father's in the hospital," she'd said. "Heart attack. You need to come home immediately." I'd abandoned everything and rushed back to Ohio, only to find my father perfectly fine sitting in the living room watching television. It wasn't a heart attack, my mother had explained casually. Just chest pain. Indigestion, probably. False alarm. But by then, I'd already given up the opportunity, and the company had moved on without me. I told myself it was just bad timing, just bad luck. But it wasn't luck. It was deliberate. My mother had known about the program because I'd mentioned it on a phone call. She'd known it would take me far away, make me independent, give me the resources and confidence to start asking uncomfortable questions. So, she'd invented an emergency to bring me home to keep me close, to ensure I stayed small and controllable for just a little bit longer. Every major opportunity I'd had in my adult life, every chance at independence or happiness had been undermined, not by coincidence, not by my own failures, but by my parents systematically dismantling any path that might lead me away from their control or toward the truth. They'd kept me poor with stolen education funds. They'd kept me isolated by destroying my relationships. They'd kept me professionally stunted by sabotaging my career. And they'd done it all while living in my house, spending my money, and making me feel grateful for whatever scraps of affection or approval they occasionally threw my way. I looked up at the house, the white siding and black shutters, the porch swing my father had built for Melissa, but never for me. This house belonged to me. It had belonged to me since I was 13 years old. Every time my mother had criticised my clothes or my hair or my presence, she'd been doing it under my roof. Every time my father had ignored me or dismissed me, he'd been eating food bought with my money. Every time Melissa had been celebrated and spoiled and given everything while I got nothing, it had been funded by the inheritance my grandmother had left specifically to protect me from exactly this kind of treatment. The wedding, the shaving. It all made sense now. They'd known this day was coming. They'd known that on my 33rd birthday, the trust would mature and I'd finally learn the truth. So they'd done everything they could to break me first, to humiliate me, to make me feel so small and worthless that even when I found out I wouldn't have the strength to fight them, they'd wanted me to slink away quietly, to be too ashamed and defeated to demand what was rightfully mine. But they'd miscalculated, because in trying to destroy me, they'd freed me. They'd stripped away everything I'd been hiding behind all the politeness and people-pleasing and desperate need for their approval. And what was left was someone who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. I stood up, folding the letter carefully and putting it back in the envelope. My phone buzzed. A text from Aunt Helen. "Did you get it?" I typed back a single word. "Yes." Her response came immediately. "Good. Now make them pay." They didn't just steal my hair, they stole my inheritance, my education, my career, my love, and 20 years of my life. I was loading my suitcase into the trunk when I heard cars pulling into the driveway. 2 of them. My mother's sedan and a silver BMW I didn't recognize. I straightened up as both drivers' side doors opened simultaneously. My mother stepped out first, still in her mother-of-the-bride dress, her face drawn and pale. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the BMW carrying a leather briefcase. He had the look of someone who charged by the minute. My mother didn't come close. She stood near her car, keeping distance between us, as if I was something contagious. The lawyer walked past her and stopped a few feet from me, his expression professionally neutral. "Jennifer Brooks?" he asked. "Yes." "My name is Richard Hartley. I represent your parents. I'm here to deliver a message." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a document, handing it to me. "Your parents are officially severing all ties with you, effective immediately. This is a formal declaration of disownment. You are no longer welcome in this home, and they request that you cease all contact with family members." I looked down at the paper. It was typed on law firm letterhead, formal, and cold, filled with phrases like irrevocable termination of familial relationship and permanent estrangement. At the bottom were my parents' signatures, already notarized. "They're disowning me," I said, slowly looking up at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Your behaviour at the wedding was unacceptable," Hartley continued in the same flat tone. "Your parents have determined that maintaining a relationship with you is detrimental to the family's reputation and well-being. Furthermore, I'm authorised to inform you that if you make any public statements regarding family financial matters, including any allegations about estates, trusts, or inheritances, they will pursue legal action for defamation and slander." I felt something cold settle in my chest. They're threatening to sue me. They're protecting themselves from false accusations. He corrected. "Mrs. Brooks has made it clear that any claims you might make about hidden assets or misappropriated funds are categorically untrue, and any attempt to spread such lies will be met with immediate legal consequences." I looked past him to my mother. She was staring at the ground, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mum," I said. "Look at me." She didn't. "You're really going to do this?" I asked. "You're going to pretend none of it happened? The trust, the money, all of it? There is no trust," my mother said, her voice tight and rehearsed. "Your grandmother left everything to the family. You're inventing things because you're angry and unstable. We've tried to help you, Jennifer, but you've made it impossible." "I have the letter," I said, "from Morrison and Associates, dated today, explaining everything." Hartley's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Concern, maybe. "If you have documentation you believe supports your claims, you're welcome to pursue them through proper legal channels. But any public statements made without definitive proof will be considered defamatory." "That's what this is about," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You're trying to keep me quiet. You know I found out, and you're trying to scare me into not telling anyone. We're protecting the family from a disturbed individual making wild accusations," my mother said, finally looking up at me. Her face was hard closed off. "You've already caused enough damage. The wedding is ruined. Melissa is devastated. Our friends and neighbours think we're monsters because of the lies you told. So yes, Jennifer, we're cutting you off for our own protection." She turned and walked back to her car without waiting for a response. Hartley handed me another document, this one detailing the defamation threat in more explicit terms. Then he got in his BMW and followed my mother back down the driveway, leaving me standing there alone. I sat down on the curb, the papers scattered around me, trying to process what had just happened. My family had disowned me. Formally, legally, permanently. They'd hired a lawyer to deliver the message because they couldn't even face me themselves. And they'd threatened to destroy me if I told the truth about what they had done. My phone rang. It was Clara. "Jen, we need to talk." "What's wrong?" "I just got a call from one of my biggest clients. She said she'd heard I was associated with you and that if I wanted to keep her business, I needed to distance myself immediately. Someone's been making calls, spreading rumours that you're mentally ill, that you made a scene at your sister's wedding, that anyone who supports you is enabling your delusions." Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm so sorry, but I have a business to protect. I can't afford to lose clients right now." "I understand," I said, even though I didn't. Even though it felt like another piece of my support system crumbling away. "I wish I could help more," Clara said. "I really do." She hung up before I could respond. 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "I can't see you anymore. Melissa's threatening to call off the wedding permanently if I have any contact with you. My parents are involved now too." "I'm sorry." I tried. I stared at the message, feeling the isolation close around me like a fist. My family had disowned me. My friend had abandoned me to save her career. Ethan had been pressured into silence. They were cutting me off from everyone, making sure I had no allies, no support, no one who would believe me when I tried to tell the truth. It was a coordinated attack, efficient and brutal, designed to leave me alone and powerless. I was still sitting there, numb, when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. I looked up to see Mrs. Rodriguez, my elderly neighbour, walking toward me with a covered dish in her hands. She was in her 70s, a small woman with grey hair and kind eyes. Someone who'd lived on this street for as long as I could remember. "Jennifer," she said gently, sitting down beside me on the curb. "I heard what happened at the wedding. The whole neighbourhood is talking about it." She set the dish on my lap. "I made you dinner. Arroz con pollo. Your grandmother's favourite." I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time that day. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you don't have to—" "Hush," she said, patting my hand. "I've lived next door to this family for 30 years, Mika. I've watched you grow up, and I've seen the way they treated you even when you were a little girl. Always different than your sister. Always less." She squeezed my hand. "When your grandmother was alive, she used to sit on my porch and tell me about you. How proud she was, how worried she was about what would happen after she was gone." "She knew," I whispered. "She knew they'd do this." "She knew," Mrs. Rodriguez confirmed. "That's why she made sure you'd have a way out, and now you do." She stood up slowly, her knees creaking. "Your mother came to my house yesterday and told me not to speak to you, said you were dangerous and unstable. But I've known you since you were 5 years old, Jennifer. You've never been anything but kind and patient, even when you had every reason not to be." She looked down at me with fierce determination. "Family isn't who shares your blood. Family is who stays when things are darkest. And I'm staying." She walked back to her house, leaving me alone again. But somehow, I felt less alone than I had moments before. I looked down at the dish of food, still warm in my hands, and something shifted inside me. They'd cut me off, isolated me, threatened me, tried to make me too afraid to fight. But they'd made a mistake, because being alone meant I had nothing left to lose. Being alone meant I was finally free to fight back. I drove to a motel on the edge of town, one of those anonymous places with weekly rates and no questions asked. The room was small and clean, with thin curtains, and a bed that sagged in the middle. I set Mrs. Rodriguez's dish on the nightstand and sat down finally, allowing myself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. Disowned, threatened, abandoned by everyone except an elderly neighbour who barely knew me. I should have felt devastated. Instead, I felt something closer to relief. The pretense was finally over. No more trying to earn love from people who are never going to give it. I ate the arroz con pollo, slowly savouring every bite, thinking about my grandmother and Mrs. Rodriguez, and the strange kindness of women who saw me when my own family refused to. When I finished, I pulled out my laptop and started researching. I needed to understand my legal options, needed to know how to fight people who were willing to lie and threaten their way out of accountability. I was deep into an article about trust law when my phone buzzed with a notification, an email from an address I didn't recognise. The subject line was empty. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but something made me open it instead. There was no text in the body of the email, just a video file attachment and a note at the bottom. 2 weeks before the wedding. I was drunk when I recorded this, but I'm sober now. I couldn't marry into a family built on lies. The sender's name was listed as E. Thompson, Ethan. My hand shook as I downloaded the file and pressed play. The video was grainy shot from a low angle, like someone had propped a phone against something, and hit record without looking. The audio was clearer than the image. I heard Ethan's voice first, slightly slurred, saying something about needing another drink. Then my father's voice, unmistakable and sharp. "Take it easy, son, you've had enough." "I'm getting married in 2 weeks," Ethan replied. "I'm entitled to get drunk." There was the sound of ice clinking in glasses, footsteps, a door closing. They must have been in my father's study, the room where he kept his expensive scotch and conducted his private business. My father spoke again, his tone shifting to something more serious, almost conspiratorial. "Since we're alone, there's something I need to discuss with you. About Jennifer." "What about her?" Ethan asked, and I could hear the wariness in his voice. "She's going to be a problem," my father said flatly. "Her birthday is the day of the wedding. She'll be 33, and when she turns 33, she's going to find out about the trust." There was a pause. "What trust?" "Her grandmother's trust. It matures on her 33rd birthday. Everything was left to Jennifer. The house, the investments, all of it. We've been managing it for 20 years, but legally, it becomes hers." My father's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "We need to make sure that doesn't happen." "What are you saying?" Ethan sounded more alert now, the drunken slur fading. "I'm saying we need Jennifer to sign a disclaimer. After the wedding, once all the guests have left and she's exhausted and emotional, we're going to sit her down and explain that there's been a misunderstanding. We'll tell her the trust was always meant for both girls, that she needs to sign documents splitting it with Melissa. She's always been compliant. She'll sign if we pressure her enough." "That's fraud," Ethan said slowly. "That's family," my father countered. "We've invested 20 years in managing that estate. We've earned our share. Besides, Jennifer doesn't need that kind of money. She'd just waste it. Melissa knows how to handle wealth. She grew up with it. Jennifer grew up scraping by because that's what she knows. This way, everyone benefits. Except Jennifer." "Jennifer will be fine," my father said dismissively. "She's always been fine. She's resilient. She'll get over it." There was a long silence. Then Ethan spoke, his voice careful. "And if she refuses to sign, she won't refuse. But if she does, we have other options. We can challenge the trust in court, claim mental incompetence, argue that our mother was manipulated in her final days. It'll be ugly and expensive, but we'll win. We always do." My father's voice hardened. "The point is, Jennifer doesn't get to walk away with millions, while her family gets nothing. After everything we've done for her, she owes us." The video ended there. I stared at the black screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. He'd admitted at everything. The plan to defraud me. The intention to manipulate me into signing away my inheritance. The willingness to lie in court if necessary. And Ethan had recorded it all. I replayed the video 3 times, making sure I'd heard correctly, that it was real and not some fever dream my exhausted mind had conjured. But it was real. The date stamp in the corner showed it was from 2 weeks ago, exactly as Ethan had said, and the audio was clear enough that my father's voice was unmistakable. I checked my email again, looking for more information, but there was nothing else. Just that single message from E. Thompson. I couldn't marry into a family built on lies. He'd texted me earlier saying he had to cut contact, that Melissa was threatening him, that his parents were involved. But he'd also sent me this. He'd given me the one thing I needed most. Proof. I pulled up my contacts and found Aunt Helen's number. She answered on the second ring. "Did something happen?" she asked without preamble. "I need to see Lawyer Morrison tomorrow morning," I said. "First thing, can you help me set that up?" "Consider it done. What happened?" "I have evidence," I said. Real evidence. A recording of my father admitting the whole plan, and I need to know what to do with it. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you, Jennifer. She always said you were stronger than you knew." "I'm not strong," I said. "I'm just done being quiet." "That's the same thing," Helen replied. "I'll call Morrison tonight. Be ready to meet at 9 tomorrow morning." I hung up and sat on the edge of the motel bed, Ethan's video file glowing on my laptop screen. My father's voice echoed in my memory. "She's resilient. She'll get over it." As if 20 years of theft and manipulation were something I should just accept and move past. As if I owed them my silence and my compliance in exchange for the bare minimum of care they'd provided while living off my inheritance. But I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. And I wasn't going to get over it. I was going to make sure everyone knew exactly what they had done, and I was going to use every legal tool at my disposal to take back what was mine. They'd threatened me with defamation suits, counting on me being too scared or too broken to fight back. They'd forgotten that people with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous kind. I saved multiple copies of the video file, uploading it to 3 different cloud services and emailing it to myself from 2 separate accounts. I wasn't going to let this evidence disappear. Then I opened a new document and started making notes. Every instance of sabotage I could remember. Michael and the lies my mother told him. The fake heart attack and the career opportunity I'd lost. The student loans I'd taken while my education fund sat untouched. Every detail, every date, everything I could recall that might help build a case. It was past midnight when I finally stopped typing. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but my mind was clear and focused. Tomorrow, I'd meet with Morrison. I'd show him the recording, the letter, my documentation. I'd ask him what my options were, how to proceed, what steps I needed to take. And then, I'd do whatever it took to expose the truth and reclaim my life. With the truth in my hands, I knew exactly what I had to do. I met with Morrison at 9 the next morning. His office was exactly what I'd expected, all dark wood and leather chairs and walls lined with law books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. He was older than I'd imagined, maybe 70, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. When I walked in, he stood and shook my hand with a grip that was surprisingly firm. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I've been waiting 20 years to meet you. Your grandmother would be very pleased to know you're here." I showed him everything. The letter he'd sent, the trust documents, the video Ethan had recorded, my notes about the sabotage, the theft of the education fund, the systematic dismantling of my opportunities. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly. "This is worse than I feared," he said quietly. "Your grandmother suspected your parents might try to hide the trust, but I don't think she imagined they'd go this far. 20 years of fraud. That's not just civil liability, that's criminal." "What do?" I asked. "We file for immediate distribution of the trust assets. We report the misappropriation to the authorities, and we make sure everyone knows what they did." He leaned forward. "But I need to warn you, Jennifer. This is going to get ugly. Your parents will fight. They'll hire expensive lawyers. They'll try to destroy your credibility. Are you prepared for that? I don't have a choice, I said. If I stay quiet, they win. He nodded slowly. Then let's make some noise. Morrison recommended I speak with a journalist, someone who specialised in financial crimes and family disputes. He gave me a name. David Chen, an investigative reporter for a Cleveland newspaper who'd broken several major stories about estate fraud and elder abuse. I called Ed Chen from Morrison's office, and he agreed to meet me that afternoon. David Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanour. We met at a coffee shop halfway between Cleveland and my hometown. I brought copies of everything, the trust documents, my notes, the video. He listened to my story for over 2 hours, asking pointed questions, taking detailed notes, recording our conversation with my permission. When I finished, he sat back and shook his head. "This is incredible," he said, "and I mean that in the worst possible way. If even half of what you're telling me checks out, this is one of the most egregious cases of family financial abuse I've ever heard." He tapped his pen against his notepad. "I'm going to need to verify everything independently, eh? Talk to Morrison, confirm the trust documents are legitimate, maybe reach out to some of the people involved. But if this is real, I want to run with it." "How long will that take?" "A week, maybe 2. I need to be thorough. Your family is going to come after me too if I get anything wrong." "I don't have 2 weeks," I said. "They've already disowned me and threatened to sue me for defamation. The longer I wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks and control the narrative." Chen studied me for a long moment. "You're sure about this?" "Once I publish, there's no going back. Your family will be publicly exposed. So will you. Are you ready for that kind of attention?" "I'm ready," I said, even though I wasn't sure I was. The article ran 4 days later. Bride's family hid sister's inheritance for 20 years, a story of theft, manipulation, and betrayal. Chen had moved fast, verifying the key facts, with Morrison pulling public records, even tracking down Michael, my ex-fiancé, who confirmed on record that my mother had contacted him with lies before our wedding. The piece was thorough, damning, and it included excerpts from Ethan's recording my father's voice coldly discussing how to defraud me. It went viral within hours. Local news stations picked it up, then regional outlets. By the end of the day, it was trending on social media, thousands of people sharing the story, commenting, expressing outrage. My phone exploded with notifications. Friend requests messages from strangers, reporters asking for interviews. I turned it off and sat in my motel room watching the story spread across the internet like wildfire, unable to quite believe it was real. For the first 24 hours, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. People were horrified by what my family had done. They called my parents monsters, criminals, narcissists. They praised me for speaking out. Some shared their own stories of family betrayal and financial abuse. I started to believe that maybe finally people would see the truth. Then my parents hired a PR firm. The counterattack was swift and coordinated. Within 48 hours of the article's publication, a press release went out from my family's lawyer. It painted me as an unstable, attention-seeking individual with a history of mental health issues and a grudge against my successful younger sister. It claimed I'd fabricated the entire story out of jealousy, that the trust was a shared family asset I was trying to steal, that the recording had been doctored or taken out of context. My mother gave a tearful interview to a local TV station, saying she was heartbroken that her daughter would tell such cruel lies, that they'd tried to get me help, but I'd refused. The narrative started to shift. People who'd initially supported me began to question. Maybe there were 2 sides to the story. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe I was mentally ill, just like my family claimed. A lifestyle blogger with 100,000 followers posted a long thread about me titled "Jennifer Brooks Victim" or "Attention Seeker." She analysed my social media, pointed out that I'd had conflicts with my family before, suggested that I might be fabricating the whole thing for sympathy and potential book deals or media appearances. "Let's be real," she wrote. "This woman crashed her sister's wedding, made a scene, and now she's playing the victim. She conveniently has a recording and documents that can't be fully verified. She's getting exactly what she wants: attention. Don't fall for the sob story." The post got thousands of shares. Comments poured in, people who'd never met me confidently declaring that I was lying, manipulating, performing. Some said I looked too put together in photos to be a real abuse victim. Others said the timing was suspicious, that real victims don't go to the press, they go to the police. A few suggested I was being paid by a rival family member or that the whole thing was a publicity stunt. My inbox filled with hateful messages, people calling me a liar, a fraud, a narcissist. Someone created a fake social media account pretending to be me and posted offensive content. Another person started a petition to have David Chen's article retracted. My parents' PR firm was good at their job, and they'd successfully planted doubt in just enough minds that the tide of public opinion began to turn. I sat in my motel room, scrolling through comment after comment, watching people dissect my life and my credibility, and I felt something close to despair. I told the truth. I had evidence. But none of that mattered when the other side had money and resources and a willingness to lie without hesitation. Then, the backlash turned, and it turned on me. I was 2 days into the worst of the backlash when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognise, but I answered anyway, too numb to care if it was another reporter or angry stranger. "Jennifer?" The voice was male, unfamiliar, hesitant. "This is Marcus Chen, David's brother. I need you to check social media right now. Something's happened." I opened my laptop, hands shaking, expecting more attacks, more accusations. Instead, the first thing I saw was a video link that had been shared thousands of times in the past hour. The title made my breath catch. Proof. Father admits plan to defraud daughter of inheritance. It was Ethan's recording, the full, unedited version. Not just the audio excerpts that had been in David's article, but the complete video time-stamped with clear visuals of my father's study, his voice, unmistakable as he laid out the entire plan. Someone had leaked it, posted it publicly, and it was spreading like wildfire. I clicked play, watching, once again as my father casually discussed it, forcing me to sign away my inheritance, admitting they'd managed my trust for 20 years, revealing his willingness to lie in court if necessary. But this time, the world was watching with me. The comments section was exploding. Thousands of people sharing it, expressing shock and outrage, apologising for doubting me. The blogger, who'd called me an attention seeker, had already deleted her post and issued a public apology. My phone rang again. David Chen this time. "Jennifer, are you seeing this?" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who posted it?" "I don't know yet, but it doesn't matter. This changes everything. No one can claim you're lying now. That's your father's voice, clear as day, admitting to fraud. My editor wants me to do a follow-up piece immediately." I spent the next hour refreshing my feed, watching the narrative transform in real time. News outlets were picking up the video. Legal analysts were weighing in, calling it a clear admission of trust fraud and potential criminal conspiracy. People who'd attacked me were backtracking, deleting their comments, claiming they'd been misled by my family's PR campaign. The tide had turned so quickly and completely that it felt surreal. Then I saw the press release. It came from Morrison and Associates, posted on their official website and distributed to every major news outlet in the state. Attorney Thomas Morrison, executor of the Margaret Brooks estate, confirms that the last will and testament of Margaret Brooks is authentic and legally binding. Miss Jennifer Brooks is the sole beneficiary of a trust valued at approximately $2.5 million, which matured on her 33rd birthday. The trust has been improperly managed for 20 years. Our firm is pursuing all available legal remedies. Morrison had gone public. He'd put his reputation and his law firm behind my story, confirming everything I'd said with the weight of legal authority. Within minutes, his statement was everywhere, shared by legal commentators and news anchors treated as definitive proof that I'd been telling the truth all along. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanting statements, lawyers offering to help strangers calling to apologise or express support. I turned it off and sat in the silence of my motel room, trying to process what was happening. For a week, I'd been painted as a liar and an attention seeker. Now, in the span of a few hours, I'd been vindicated so thoroughly that my family's PR campaign had collapsed completely. It was a late afternoon when I finally turned my phone back on and saw the notification. Ethan had posted a statement on social media. It was long, carefully worded, and brutally honest. I read it 3 times, tears blurring my vision by the end. I need to address what's been happening with the Brooks family situation he'd written. My name is Ethan Thompson. I was engaged to Melissa Brooks until recently. I've stayed silent through most of this, pressured by family and circumstance, but I can't stay silent anymore. Jennifer Brooks told the truth, every word of it. I witnessed the aftermath of what was done to her. I saw the way her family treated her, dismissed her, humiliated her. I heard her father admit to planning fraud. I'm the one who recorded that conversation, and I'm the one who leaked the full video today because I couldn't let her be destroyed for speaking the truth. He went on to detail what he'd seen the wedding confrontation, the deliberate cruelty, his own complicity in staying quiet. And then, in the final paragraph, Jennifer deserved better from all of us. From her family, from me, from everyone who stood by and watched her be mistreated. She's one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I'm ashamed it took me this long to do the right thing. To anyone who attacked her, questioned her, or dismissed her story, you owe her an apology. I know I do. The post had tens of thousands of likes and shares within an hour. People were calling Ethan brave for coming forward, praising him for doing the right thing. Some part of me wanted to be angry that he was getting credit for simply telling the truth, after weeks of pressure to stay silent. But mostly, I just felt exhausted relief. He'd given me the evidence I needed when I needed it most. He'd validated my story when the world was ready to write me off as crazy. David Chen called again. I'm running the follow-up piece tomorrow, How a Family's Lies Unraveled the Jennifer Brooks Case. I have statements from Morris and comments from legal experts and Ethan's post. Your parents' lawyer has gone dark. No one from their PR firm will return my calls. They know they've lost. What happens now? I asked. Now you've won the court of public opinion, which means your parents are going to have a much harder time fighting you in actual court. Morrison says he's filing for emergency distribution of the trust assets first thing Monday morning. With this much public attention, no judge is going to let them drag this out. I thanked him and hung up, then opened my laptop and started reading through the messages that had poured in over the past few hours. Apologies from people who doubted me. Support from abuse survivors who saw themselves in my story. Messages from lawyers offering pro bono help, from advocacy groups wanting to feature my case, from strangers who just wanted to say they believed me and they were sorry for what I'd endured. One message stood out. It was from Michael, my ex-fiancé, the man my mother had lied to 4 years ago. I saw what happened, he wrote. I'm so sorry I believed your mother. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to hear your side. You deserved so much better, and I failed you. I hope you get everything that's rightfully yours. I closed the laptop and sat back, letting myself feel everything I'd been holding in for the past week. The fear, the anger, the vindication, the grief. My family had tried to destroy me twice, once slowly over 20 years, and once quickly when I dared to fight back. But they'd failed. The truth had come out messy and painful and public, but undeniable. I thought about my grandmother, about the way she'd planned for this moment, setting up the trust to mature at 33, instructing Morrison to send the letter on my birthday, protecting me from beyond the grave in the only way she could. She'd known. She'd known exactly what my parents would do, and she'd given me the tools to fight back. I wished I could thank her. Tell her it had worked. Tell her I'd finally stood up for myself the way she'd always believed I could. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Aunt Helen. I knew you'd win. Your grandmother always said you were a fighter, even when you didn't know it yourself. Now, show them what happens when a fighter has nothing left to lose. I stood up and walked to the mirror, looking at my reflection. My shaved head had started to grow out a soft fuzz covering my scalp. I looked different than I had 2 weeks ago. Harder, maybe, but also freer. They tried to make me invisible, and I'd become impossible to ignore. They tried to silence me, and I'd made the world listen. But I wasn't done yet. The press conference was announced the next morning. My parents would be making a statement at 2:00 that afternoon at the country club, the same venue where the wedding had been supposed to take place. The announcement came from their lawyer's office, carefully worded, promising to clarify misunderstandings and address false allegations. I saw it on the news while eating breakfast at a diner near the motel. The reporter said my parents appeared eager to set the record straight, and that they would be explaining their side of the story to concerned community members. I called Morrison immediately. They're trying to control the narrative again. Let them try, he said calmly. They've already lost. Anything they say now will only make it worse. I want to be there, I said. I want to face them. There was a pause. Jennifer, I'm not sure that's wise. The media will turn it into a spectacle. Good, I said. Let them watch. I arrived at the country club at 1:45, early enough to slip in before the bulk of the media assembled outside. The conference was being held in the same ballroom where the reception should have happened, chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small podium with a microphone. I took a seat in the back corner, partially hidden behind a pillar, and waited. Reporters filed in, cameras and recording equipment ready. I recognised some of them from the news stations that had covered the story. A few community members scattered throughout the room, curious neighbours and family friends who wanted to hear what my parents would say. At 2:00 exactly, my parents entered through a side door flanked by their lawyer. My mother wore a navy dress and pearls, her hair perfect, her face composed in an expression of dignified suffering. My father was in a dark suit, his jaw set, his eyes fixed straight ahead. They looked like victims preparing to defend themselves against a terrible injustice. They looked nothing like the people who'd held me down and shaved my head, who'd stolen my inheritance and sabotaged my life. The lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced. Thank you all for coming. My clients have been subjected to a vicious campaign of defamation by their daughter, who has chosen to air private family matters in the most public and hurtful way possible. They're here today to set the record straight and to ask for understanding during this difficult time. My mother stepped up to the microphone, her hands clasped in front of her. Jennifer has always been a troubled child. She began, her voice wavering slightly. We've tried to help her, tried to give her the support she needed, but she's always resented her sister's success. What happened at the wedding was heartbreaking for our entire family. And now these accusations, these lies about money and trusts, it's too much. We raised her, we loved her, and this is how she repays us. My father leaned toward the microphone. We want to make it clear that Jennifer's grandmother left her estate to the family, not to one individual. The trust was always meant to benefit everyone. Jennifer has twisted the truth to paint herself as a victim, when in reality she's trying to steal from her own sister. I stood up. The movement caught the attention of a reporter in the front row, then another, heads turned, cameras swiveled. My mother's eyes found me and I watched the colour drain from her face. She stopped mid-sentence, her mouth opening and closing, soundlessly. My father followed her gaze, and his expression shifted from confident to panicked in an instant. I walked down the centre aisle, my footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Every camera in the room tracked my movement. I didn't hurry. I didn't look away. I just walked steady and deliberate until I reached the front of the room. My mother stepped back from the microphone automatically, and I took her place. "My name is Jennifer Brooks," I said, my voice clear and calm. "And everything they just told you is a lie." The room erupted in whispers and the rapid click of camera shutters. I reached into my bag and pulled out a certified copy of my grandmother's will, the one Morrison had provided me with the official seal and notarization clearly visible. I held it up so every camera could see it. 20 years ago, my grandmother left me everything, I said, my eyes moving across the faces in the crowd. "This house you're sitting in, $2.5 million in trust, an education fund that should have paid for my college, everything. She left it all to me, her first granddaughter, because she knew exactly what kind of people my parents were, and she wanted to protect me from them." I paused, letting that sink in. My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. My father reached for her arm, but she jerked away from him. "They didn't tell me," I continued. "For 20 years, they lived in my house, managed my money, took fees from my trust, and told me I was lucky they kept me fed. They stole my college fund and watched me drown in $60,000 of student loans. They sabotaged my career. They destroyed my engagement. They did everything they could to keep me small and controlled and nearby, because if I ever found out the truth, their comfortable life would end." I looked directly at my mother. She was crying now, real tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, but they didn't move me. Not anymore. 2 weeks ago, on the day I turned 33, they shaved my head while I slept. They held me down in a chair and took everything from me that they could, one last desperate attempt to humiliate me into silence. My mother told me I needed to be humbled, that I'd always been too noticeable, too much, and maybe she was right. Maybe I was too noticeable for a family that wanted to keep me invisible so I wouldn't ask questions they couldn't answer. The room was completely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped moving their cameras trained on me recording every word. "They shaved my head to make me small," I said, and my voice was steady, strong, certain. "But today, I'm not small. I'm not silent, and I'm not going anywhere." I placed the will on the podium directly in front of the microphone, the official seal facing the cameras. Then I turned and walked away, back down that centre aisle, my head high, my shoulders straight. I didn't look back at my parents. I didn't need to. I could feel their collapse behind me, the weight of their lies finally crushing them in front of everyone they tried to impress. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice, thin and desperate. "Jennifer, please." But I kept walking. I pushed through the doors and into the bright afternoon sunlight, where reporters immediately swarmed, shouting questions I didn't answer. I got into my car and drove away, leaving them all behind. My phone started buzzing before I'd even left the parking lot. Texts from Aunt Helen, from Morrison, from David Chen, all saying some variation of the same thing. "You did it. You won." But I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about my grandmother, about how she'd given me the tools to fight back, and how I'd finally used them. Not for revenge, not for money, but for the simple, powerful act of telling the truth in a room full of people who'd been told lies. After that moment, they had nothing left to say. The video of the press conference went viral within hours. Every major news outlet ran clips of me holding up the will, my voice steady as I laid out 20 years of theft and manipulation, while my parents stood frozen behind me. The image of my mother crying, my father pale and speechless, became a meme shared thousands of times with captions about karma and justice. But it wasn't just online outrage. The consequences came swiftly and decisively in ways I hadn't anticipated. 2 days after the press conference, my parents appeared on a local morning show attempting damage control. I watched from my motel room as they sat on a pastel couch holding hands, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of remorse. My mother spoke first, her voice soft and trembling. "We made mistakes," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "We should have been more transparent with Jennifer about her grandmother's estate. We thought we were protecting the family, but we see now that we hurt her deeply. We're sorry for that." My father nodded beside her. "We never meant to cause Jennifer pain. Everything we did believing it was in everyone's best interest. We hope she can find it in her heart to forgive us." The host, a woman in her 50s with skeptical eyes, leaned forward. "But the recording clearly shows you admitting to planning fraud. You discussed forcing your daughter to sign away her inheritance. How do you explain that?" My father's jaw tightened. "That conversation was taken out of context. I'd been drinking. I said things I didn't mean." "So you didn't mean to defraud your daughter of $2.5 million. We managed that trust responsibly for 20 years. My mother interjected, her voice gaining an edge. "We lived modestly. We used the money for family expenses, including Jennifer's upbringing. She's twisting this into something it wasn't." The host looked at the camera. "We reached out to Jennifer Brooks for comment. She declined to appear, but provided this statement." She read from a card. "My parents had 20 years to tell me the truth. They chose lies, theft, and humiliation instead. Their apology means nothing." The interview ended badly. Social media erupted with accusations that my parents were still lying still, trying to play victims. Comments flooded in from people who'd watched the press conference video, pointing out the contradictions, the lack of genuine remorse. The hashtag that had been trending justice for Jennifer transformed into boycott Brooks family. By that evening, my mother's employer, a prestigious interior design firm, released a statement announcing her immediate termination, citing damage to the company's reputation and values. My father's architecture firm followed suit 3 days later, though his situation was more complicated. He owned the business, but his clients didn't. One by one, they cancelled contracts and pulled projects. A downtown renovation worth $500,000 was terminated. A residential development deal fell through. His partners, the 2 men who'd worked with him for 15 years, issued a public statement distancing themselves from his actions and announcing they were dissolving the partnership. Within a week, my father had no choice but to close the firm entirely. I learned all this not from my family, but from the news and from Aunt Helen, who called regularly with updates delivered in a tone that mixed satisfaction with concern. "Your mother's been calling me," she said one afternoon, "begging me to talk to you, to convince you to drop the legal action. I told her I wouldn't, but Jennifer, they're losing everything." "They stole everything from me first," I said, and I didn't feel guilty. The social consequences were perhaps even more devastating than the financial ones. Mrs. Rodriguez told me during one of her visits to the motel with containers of homemade food that the neighborhood had turned on my parents completely. "No one speaks to them anymore," she said, shaking her head. "At the grocery store, people walk the other way. Their church asked them to stop attending services. The book club your mother belonged to for 10 years uninvited her. I've never seen anything like it." Melissa bore her share of the fallout too. She had been working as a freelance event coordinator, planning weddings and corporate functions for wealthy clients who valued discretion and reputation. Within 2 weeks of the press conference, she'd lost every contract. Brides cancelled, citing concerns about associating with the Brooks family name. Corporate clients quietly moved on to other planners. Her business, built over 5 years of networking and careful reputation management, evaporated. I found myself feeling an unexpected twinge of sympathy for her, quickly followed by anger at my own softness. Melissa had wanted my head shaved. She'd orchestrated that humiliation because she couldn't stand the idea of me being noticed at her wedding. Whatever she was suffering now, she'd earned. Ethan had broken off the engagement entirely, I learnt from a brief statement he posted online. After much consideration, Melissa and I have decided to end our relationship. I wish her well. The message was diplomatic, but everyone understood what it meant. He'd walked away from the entire Brooks family, and who could blame him? I stayed away from it all holed up in my motel room, or taking long drives through the countryside watching autumn settle over Ohio in shades of gold and rust. Morrison handled the legal proceedings, filing motions and paperwork I barely understood, assuring me that the trust would be transferred to my control within a matter of weeks. The house would be mine. The money would be mine. My parents would be ordered to repay the misappropriated education fund, though Morrison warned that getting blood from a stone might prove difficult now that my father's business had collapsed. David Chen published his follow-up piece, a detailed examination of how the truth had emerged and what it meant for cases of family financial abuse. He interviewed other victims, people who'd been defrauded by relatives and had never spoken up out of shame or fear. My story, he wrote, had given them permission to come forward. I became, whether I wanted it or not, a reluctant symbol of fighting back against family manipulation. But through it all, through the satisfaction of watching my parents lose their carefully constructed reputation, through the vindication of being believed and supported, I felt something still unresolved, some piece of the story that didn't quite fit. Why had Melissa really orchestrated the head shaving? Jealousy seemed too simple, too surface level. And why had my mother been so desperate to keep me from discovering the truth that she'd been willing to destroy my relationships, my career, my sense of self-worth? I thought about the timing again. The wedding scheduled for my 33rd birthday, the sudden urgency to humiliate me just days before, the way my mother had looked when I'd mentioned my grandmother's will, that flash of something deeper than annoyance. It wasn't just about the money. It couldn't be. There was something else, some other truth buried beneath the layers of lies I'd already uncovered. Yet the most shocking truth was still hidden. The call came from a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice on the other end was one I knew too well. My mother's thin and fractured in a way I'd never heard before. "Jennifer, please. It's Melissa. She's in the hospital. She collapsed. You need to come." I should have hung up. After everything they'd done, after the lies and the theft and the humiliation, I owed them nothing. But something in my mother's voice, raw terror stripped of all pretense, made me ask, "What hospital?" She told me, and I drove there against every instinct of self-preservation I had. The hospital was 20 minutes away, a modern building with 2 bright lights and the smell of antiseptic that made my stomach turn. I found my mother in the waiting room, hunched in a plastic chair, her hair uncombed, her makeup smudged. She looked up when I approached, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Where is she?" I asked. "Room 412. They're running tests." My mother's hands twisted in her lap. "She's been hiding it. She didn't want anyone to know." I didn't wait for more explanation. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and found the room. Melissa was lying in the hospital bed, an IV in her arm, her face pale against the white pillows. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that seemed impossible for someone who'd orchestrated my humiliation just weeks ago. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. "You came," she whispered. "Mom called. She said you collapsed." I stood in the doorway, not quite able to make myself enter the room fully. "What's going on, Melissa?" She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. The careful mask she'd always worn, the performance of perfection, had cracked completely. "I have breast cancer, stage 2. I was diagnosed 6 months ago." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my knees weaken, found myself gripping the doorframe for support. 6 months before the wedding. Before the engagement, actually, she laughed, a bitter sound. "I found the lump last winter, had a biopsy in February. The doctor told me I'd need surgery and chemo. He said I'd probably be okay, that we'd caught it early, but there were no guarantees." She reached up to touch her hair, that perfect blonde hair she'd always been so proud of. "I was supposed to start treatment right after the wedding, but everything fell apart and I've been postponing it because I couldn't deal with losing my hair and my reputation at the same time." I moved into the room, slowly pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because Mum didn't want me to." Melissa's voice was hollow. "She said if people knew, they'd treat me differently. They'd pity me. And she was right about that, at least. But more than that, she said I needed to get married before everyone found out." that Ethan came from money that his family could help with medical bills that I needed to secure my future before the cancer secured it for me. I stared at her understanding dawning like a sickening sunrise. She pressured you to marry him. She told me I was running out of time, that I needed to lock him down before I got too sick, before the treatment started, before I lost my looks. Melissa's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks. And then you came home and you were so beautiful, Jennifer. You've always been beautiful, even when we tried to make you think you weren't. And I looked at you and thought about how in a few months I'd be bald and sick and maybe dying, and you'd still be healthy and whole and perfect. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The wedding scheduled for my birthday. The desperation to humiliate me. The hair. It had never been just about jealousy or attention. It had been about a dying woman trying to hold on to the one thing she thought she had left. The shaving, I said quietly. You wanted them to shave my head because you were going to lose yours. I know how terrible that sounds, Melissa said, her voice breaking. I know there's no excuse, but I was so scared, Jennifer, so angry. I kept thinking, if I'm losing my hair to chemo, why does she get to keep hers? Why does she get to be healthy when I'm falling apart? It wasn't rational. It wasn't fair. But I couldn't stop thinking it, and Mum kept pushing, and she covered her face with her hands. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. I sat there trying to reconcile the sister who'd betrayed me with the terrified woman in front of me, and I realised they were the same person. Melissa hadn't been evil. She'd been desperate and manipulated and sick, pushed by our mother into making choices that destroyed us both. Our mother who'd stolen my inheritance and pressured Melissa into a loveless marriage, who'd pitted us against each other our entire lives because it served her purposes, who'd turned her dying daughter into a weapon against her healthy one. Does Mum know? I asked. About the cancer? Of course she knows. She's known since the beginning. She's the one who told me to keep it secret. Melissa lowered her hands, and I saw the exhaustion in her face, the kind that came from carrying a terrible burden alone for too long. She said, if you found out, you'd use it against me. That you'd tell everyone I was trying to trap Ethan, that you'd ruin my chances at happiness. She made me believe you were the enemy when really, her voice caught, when really we were both just trying to survive her. I reached out slowly and took Melissa's hand. It was cold, her fingers thin and trembling. She looked at me with surprise, then squeezed back desperately, like I was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. I'm sorry too, I said, and meant it. I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry she did this to both of us. We sat like that for a long time, two sisters who'd spent 30 years being turned against each other, finally understanding that we'd never been enemies at all. We'd been victims of the same manipulation, just in different ways. My sister didn't just envy me. She was dying, and no one saw it. I left the hospital that evening with a strange heaviness in my chest, a weight that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. Understanding Melissa's pain didn't erase what she'd done, but it complicated the anger I'd been carrying. She was a victim too manipulated by the same mother who'd controlled and diminished me for 33 years. But that didn't mean I owed her reconciliation. It didn't mean I had to go back. My mother was still in the waiting room when I walked past. She stood as I approached, her expression hopeful, desperate. Jennifer, can we talk? Please. We need to figure out how to help Melissa through this as a family. I stopped, looked at her directly, and saw not the powerful figure who'd terrorized my childhood, but a woman whose empire of lies had crumbled. We're not a family, Mum. We never were. You made sure of that. I kept walking, and this time she didn't follow. I went back to the motel and sat on the bed staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to call Melissa to check on her, to offer some kind of support. But I couldn't, not yet. Maybe not ever. Compassion didn't require proximity. I could feel sorry for her suffering without subjecting myself to the toxicity that still surrounded her. So I did nothing, and I let myself feel okay about that choice. The next week, Aunt Helen sent me information about a support group for women who'd experienced emotional abuse from family members. It met Thursday evenings at a community centre in Cleveland, about an hour's drive from where I was staying. I almost didn't go. The idea of sitting in a circle, sharing my story with the strangers, felt exposing in a way that even the press conference hadn't. But I went anyway, walking into a room of 12 women ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s each, carrying their own history of being diminished by people who should have loved them. I listened that first night, letting their stories wash over me. A woman whose mother had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit. Another whose father had convinced her she was incompetent and stupid until she believed it herself. A third who'd been scapegoated by her entire family for problems she didn't create. They spoke with a combination of pain and strength that I recognized in myself, and for the first time since everything began, I didn't feel alone in the particular way my family had damaged me. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. My name is Jennifer. My parents stole my inheritance and spent 20 years making me believe I was worthless, and I'm still figuring out how to trust myself again. The group leader, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and grey hair, nodded. "That's enough for today," she said. "You don't have to have all the answers yet." I started going every week. Between sessions I wrote, not for therapy, though it served that purpose too, but for an article David Chen had asked me to contribute to a national magazine. They wanted my perspective on family financial abuse, on what it meant to reclaim your voice after years of being silenced. I wrote about the systematic ways my parents had kept me small, the ways they'd convinced me I was a burden and should be grateful for scraps. I wrote about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about how you could understand someone's pain without absolving them of responsibility. The article, titled "Reclaiming Your Voice After Family Betrayal," was published 3 weeks later. It went viral almost immediately, shared by thousands of people who saw their own experiences reflected in mine. I received emails from readers telling me I'd given them permission to set boundaries, to walk away, to stop feeling guilty for protecting themselves. Some said I'd inspired them to seek legal recourse against family members who'd defrauded them. Others just wanted to say thank you for making them feel less alone. Meanwhile, Morrison moved forward with the legal proceedings. The trust had been transferred to my control. The house, officially, mined the investment accounts accessible. But that was just the beginning. I wanted my parents held accountable, not just financially, but criminally. Morrison filed a comprehensive lawsuit against them for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, theft, and 20 years of financial exploitation. The amount we were seeking included the stolen education fund, improper trustee fees, emotional damages, and interest compounded over 2 decades. "This will take time," Morrison warned me during one of our meetings. 9 months, maybe longer, before we get to trial. They'll fight every step of the way. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Melissa in her hospital bed, about the support group, women who'd carried their pain for decades, about my grandmother, who'd tried to protect me from beyond the grave. "I'm prepared," I said. The lawsuit was filed in late October. By then, autumn had given way to the first hints of winter, bare trees and cold winds that felt appropriate for the season of reckoning I was entering. My parents responded through their lawyer with a motion to dismiss, claiming I was vindictive and unreasonable, that they'd managed the trust in good faith, that I was exploiting Melissa's illness for sympathy. The motion was denied. The case would proceed. I moved out of the motel, finally renting a small apartment in Cleveland, closer to my support group and farther from the town where I'd grown up. I furnished it simply, buying only what I needed, learning to live in space that was entirely my own. Mrs. Rodriguez visited once, bringing me a plant for the windowsill and telling me she was proud of me. Aunt Helen came by regularly, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit and talk about my grandmother and what she would have thought of everything that had happened. I didn't see my parents. I didn't see Melissa, though. I heard updates through Aunt Helen. She'd started treatment, finally the chemo that would save her life and take her hair, just as she'd feared. Part of me wanted to reach out to offer something, but I wasn't ready. Understanding her circumstances didn't erase the harm. Sympathy didn't require sacrifice. Forgiveness would wait. First, I needed justice. The trial began exactly 1 year after the wedding on a grey morning in early June. I stood outside the courthouse watching people stream through the security checkpoints, reporters already gathering on the steps, and I felt surprisingly calm. A year ago, I'd been a different person, desperate and broken, and unsure if I'd survive what my family had done to me. Now I was standing on the courthouse steps in a navy suit, my hair grown out to a short pixie cut, ready to face them one last time. Morrison met me at the entrance, briefcase in hand, his expression serious but confident. "Sarah's already inside setting up," he said. Sarah Mitchell was the young attorney who'd reached out to me 4 months into the lawsuit, offering to work pro bono alongside Morrison. She was 32, sharp and relentless, with a personal stake in cases like mine. Her own father had been defrauded by his brother over a family business, and by the time they'd discovered the theft, it was too late to recover anything. He died bitter and betrayed. Sarah had gone into law to make sure other families didn't suffer the same fate. We walked into the courtroom together, and I saw my parents for the first time in months. They sat at the defense table with their legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits who'd been hired by some cousin with money, someone who believed the family narrative that I was the problem. My mother looked older, her hair more grey than I remembered her face drawn. My father stared straight ahead, refusing to look at me. Melissa wasn't there. She was too sick, still recovering from her latest round of treatment. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Hartman, known for her no-nonsense approach to financial fraud cases. We rose, then sat, and the proceedings began. My parents' lead attorney, a man named Richard Paulson, with silver hair and a voice like honey, stood to give his opening statement. He painted a picture of devoted parents who'd managed their daughter's inheritance responsibly, who'd made difficult choices in good faith, who were now being persecuted by an ungrateful child seeking revenge and attention. "The Brooks family has been torn apart by these accusations," Paulson said, gesturing toward my parents. "Not because they did anything wrong, but because their daughter couldn't accept that love sometimes means making hard decisions. They managed that trust for 20 years, ensuring it grew, ensuring it was protected. And this is how they're repaid." Sarah stood for our opening statement, and her voice was clear and cold. "This case is not about love or family loyalty. It's about theft. For 20 years, the defendants lived in a house that belonged to their daughter. They collected fees from a trust that belonged to their daughter. They spent money earmarked for her education while she borrowed $60,000 she's still repaying. And when she was about to discover the truth, they humiliated her in the most degrading way possible, hoping to break her spirit before she could fight back. This is not a family dispute. This is fraud, and we're going to prove it." The first day was devoted to evidence. Morrison took the lead, methodically, presenting documents, the will, the trust papers, the education fund statements, showing the money had been withdrawn and never used for its intended purpose. He showed the court records of my student loans, the interest compounding year after year, while my college fund sat in an account my parents controlled. Paulson objected, frequently arguing about relevance and interpretation, but Judge Hartman overruled him, each time her expression growing increasingly stern. On the second day, we played Ethan's recording. The courtroom was silent as my father's voice filled the space, casual and confident, as he discussed forcing me to sign away my inheritance, as he laughed about my compliance, as he revealed his willingness to lie under oath, if necessary. I watched the jury, saw their faces change as they listened. When it ended, Paulson stood immediately, arguing the recording was taken without proper consent, that my father had been drunk, that it was inadmissible. Judge Hartman listened, then denied the motion. "The recording was made by a participant in the conversation," she said. "It's admissible." Morrison called his witnesses. First was Morrison himself testifying about my grandmother's explicit instructions, her concerns about my parents, her determination to protect me. Then, Ms. Rodriguez, who spoke quietly but firmly about watching me grow up neglected and dismissed while Melissa was celebrated. She described my mother's coldness, my father's indifference, the clear favoritism that had defined my childhood. "Did Jennifer ever complain?" Sarah asked her. "Never," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "She was the kindest child, always patient, always trying to please them. It broke my heart to watch." Paulson cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Mrs. Rodriguez as a bitter neighbour with an axe to grind, but she held firm, her testimony unshaken. When she stepped down, I caught her eye and mouthed, "Thank you." She nodded. On the third day, I took the stand. Sarah guided me through my testimony, and I spoke calmly, recounting the theft of my education fund, the sabotaged engagement, the fake medical emergency that cost me a career opportunity, and finally, the shaving. I described waking up to my mother standing over me, the hairdresser's clippers, the way they'd held me down. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just told the truth exactly as it had happened. Paulson's cross-examination was brutal. He accused me of exaggerating, of holding grudges, of being mentally unstable. He brought up my public confrontation at the wedding, suggesting I was prone to dramatic displays. He implied I'd fabricated evidence and coached witnesses. Sarah objected repeatedly, and Judge Hartman sustained most of them, but Paulson kept pushing, trying to find a crack in my composure. "Isn't it true, Miss Brooks, that you've profited significantly from this narrative speaking fees article? Payments, media attention." "I wrote one article," I said evenly. "I was paid $300, and I've spent every speaking opportunity telling other victims they have the right to stand up for themselves. If that's profit, I'll take it." The jury deliberated for 3 weeks. During that time, I went back to my apartment, back to my support group, back to the life I'd been building. I didn't obsess over the outcome. I told my truth in a room where it mattered, where it would be weighed and judged by people who had no reason to protect my parents. Whatever happened next, I'd done everything I could. When the call came that the jury had reached a verdict, I drove back to the courthouse with Sarah and Morrison. We took our seats, and my parents took theirs, and the jury filed in with expressions I couldn't read. The foreperson stood holding a piece of paper and handed it to the bailiff, who handed it to Judge Hartman. She read it silently, her face impassive. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to speak. Judge Hartman looked up from the paper, her eyes moving across the courtroom before settling on my parents. "The jury has reached a unanimous verdict," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority accumulated over decades on the bench. "In the matter of Brooks versus Brooks on all counts, the court finds in favour of the plaintiff, Jennifer Brooks." I felt Sarah's hand squeeze mine under the table. Morrison let out a breath he'd been holding. Across the aisle, my father's head dropped, and my mother made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. Their attorney, Paulson, immediately began shuffling papers, already preparing whatever appeal he could mount, but Judge Hartman wasn't finished. "This court finds that the defendants, Claire and Robert Brooks, engaged in systematic breach of fiduciary duty fraud and financial exploitation spanning 20 years. The evidence presented was overwhelming and unambiguous. The defendants knowingly concealed the existence of a trust from its rightful beneficiary, misappropriated funds designated for educational purposes, and actively sabotaged the plaintiff's personal and professional opportunities to maintain control over assets that were never theirs to control." She paused, looking down at the documents before her, then continued. "The defendants are hereby ordered to pay restitution in the following amounts: return of the education fund in the amount of $100,000 plus interest, totaling $143,000. Disgorgement of improperly collected trustee fees in the amount of $1 million. Compensation for emotional distress and intentional infliction of emotional harm in the amount of $500,000, legal fees and court costs in the amount of $200,000. The total judgment is $2,843,000 payable immediately. The number hung in the air. It was more than I'd expected, more than Morrison had projected. My parents would have to sell everything they had left, and it still wouldn't be enough. They'd be financially destroyed, and some part of me waited to feel satisfaction at that thought. But I felt only a hollow sense of completion, like finishing a long, exhausting race. Judge Hartman continued, her tone hardening. Furthermore, this court requires a formal public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, please stand. My parents rose slowly, my father supporting my mother's elbow as she swayed slightly. They looked diminished, older than their years, stripped of the carefully maintained facade they'd worn my entire life. You will provide in writing and read aloud in this courtroom a full admission of your actions. You will acknowledge that you concealed your daughter's inheritance, that you stole funds meant for her education, and that you deliberately undermined her opportunities for personal gain. This statement will be entered into the public record. Do you understand? My father's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honour. Then you will do so now. Paulson stood objecting, arguing that this was unusual, punitive, unnecessary. Judge Hartman cut him off. Your clients engaged in 20 years of calculated deception and abuse. A monetary judgment is insufficient. They will acknowledge what they've done or they will face contempt charges. Mr. Brooks, proceed. My father pulled a piece of paper from his pocket with shaking hands. His voice cracked as he read. We, Claire and Robert Brooks, acknowledge that we knowingly concealed the existence of a trust established by Margaret Brooks for the benefit of our daughter, Jennifer Marie Brooks. We used funds from this trust for our own purposes, while telling Jennifer she had nothing. We took the education fund meant for her college expenses and allowed her to accumulate significant debt. We interfered with her relationships and career opportunities to prevent her from becoming independent and discovering our fraud. We humiliated her and attempted to break her spirit when we realized she was about to learn the truth. We are guilty of everything alleged and more. He lowered the paper. My mother was crying openly now, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her face. I looked at them and felt nothing resembling victory. They were broken, exposed, facing consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. But I took no pleasure in their pain. I'd never wanted to destroy them. I'd only wanted them to stop destroying me. Judge Hartman banged her gavel. This case is concluded. The judgment will be enforced immediately. She stood, and we all stood with her, and then she was gone, disappearing into her chambers. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters rushing for the doors, Sarah hugging me, Morrison shaking my hand with genuine warmth. My parents walked past without looking at me, Paulson hurrying them toward a side exit to avoid the media. Just before they reached the door, my mother turned back. Our eyes met across the room. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Then she turned away and was gone. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us, shouting questions. Sarah handled them expertly, reading a brief statement about justice being served and victims having the right to hold abusers accountable. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said in that courtroom. When they pressed for a comment for some expression of how I felt, I finally spoke. I don't feel victorious, I said quietly. I feel relieved. This was never about revenge or making them suffer. It was about standing up and saying what they did was wrong. It was about making sure the truth was heard in a place where it mattered, where it would be weighed and judged fairly. That's all I ever wanted. We drove back to Morrison's office, where we'd celebrate with coffee and pastries, where Sarah would explain the enforcement process and what came next. But in the car, in the quiet moment before Morrison started the engine, I let myself sit with what had just happened. A judge had looked at the evidence of my life and ruled that I'd been wronged. A jury of strangers had believed me. My parents had been forced to admit on the record exactly what they'd done. Justice isn't revenge. It's truth spoken in a room where lies can't hide. 2 weeks after the trial ended, Ethan called. I almost didn't answer his name on my phone screen, stirring up memories I'd worked hard to put in their proper place. But curiosity won out, and I picked up on the fourth ring. Jennifer, he said, and I heard exhaustion in his voice. I know I have no right to ask, but could we meet just for coffee? There are things I need to say. We met at a cafe halfway between Cleveland and his apartment in Columbus, a neutral space with good lighting and terrible coffee. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, looking thinner than I remembered his face drawn, with the kind of fatigue that comes from carrying weight you can't put down. He stood when he saw me, and for a moment we just looked at each other, two people who'd been tangled up in each other's lives in ways neither of us had wanted. Thank you for coming, he said as we sat down. You sounded like you needed to talk, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, staring into it, like it held answers. I filed for divorce from Melissa last month. It's been final for a week now. He looked up at me. I couldn't stay, not in that family, not in that marriage, not in a relationship that was built on lies from the beginning. I tried. I really did. But every time I looked at her, I thought about what they did to you, and I couldn't pretend anymore. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me felt sorry for Melissa, already battling cancer, and now facing a divorce on top of everything else. But another part, the part that had been shaved and humiliated and systematically destroyed, understood exactly why Ethan had left. How is she? I asked, because someone needed to. Finishing treatment. The prognosis is good. Her aunt moved in to help. He paused. She asked me to tell you she's sorry. I don't know if that matters to you, but I told her I'd pass it along. It matters, I said quietly, but it doesn't change anything. I know. He took a breath, and I saw him gathering courage for whatever he'd really come to say. Jennifer, I need to tell you something I should have said 7 years ago. I loved you then. I never stopped. And when I saw you again at your parents' house, standing there, after everything they'd done to you, still strong, still fighting, I knew I'd made the biggest mistake of my life letting you go. The words hung between us, and I felt an old ache, a ghost of what might have been. 7 years ago, we'd been good together, easy and uncomplicated. And then he'd left for Chicago, and I'd stayed in Ohio, and we'd both made choices that led us here to this moment, where he was offering me something I might have desperately wanted once. Ethan, I said gently, we were the right people at the wrong time. We could be the right people now, he said, reaching across the table. I let him take my hand, but didn't squeeze back. I'm not asking you to forgive me for marrying your sister. I'm not asking you to forget everything that happened. I'm just asking if there's a chance we could start over. No history, no baggage, just us trying again. I looked at our joined hands and thought about all the ways my life had changed in the past year. I'd learned to stand alone, to trust myself to build a life that didn't require anyone else's validation or support. I'd learned that I didn't need to be rescued or loved back into wholeness. I'd done that work myself in therapy and support groups and quiet nights in my apartment, learning who I was when I wasn't performing for people who would never see me clearly. I can't, I said, and I saw hope die in his eyes. Not because I don't care about you. I do. But you didn't choose me first, Ethan. 7 years ago, you chose Chicago. A year ago, you chose Melissa. And I need someone who chooses me from the start, not after all the other options fall apart. He pulled his hand back, slowly nodding. You're right, you deserve that. So, do you, I said, and I meant it. You deserve someone you choose first too. Someone who isn't connected to all this pain and history. We're too tangled up in each other's worst moments. We'd never get free of it. I know, he said, his voice rough. I just needed to tell you. I needed you to know that I saw you. Really saw you. And that I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner, or better, or in the way you deserved. We sat in silence for a while, drinking our terrible coffee, letting the truth of what we were saying to each other settle in. This was goodbye. Not the kind filled with anger or resentment, but the kind that acknowledged what had been and what couldn't be. The kind that hurt because it was the right choice, not the easy one. When we stood to leave, Ethan pulled me into a hug. I let myself lean into it for a moment, feeling the solid warmth of someone who'd helped me, who'd given me the evidence I needed, who'd been a part of my story, even if he couldn't be part of my future. You deserve someone who chose you first, he whispered against my hair. Someone who saw you and never looked away. Promise me you won't settle for less. I promise, I said. We walked out of the cafe together and stood on the sidewalk, and then we went to our separate cars and drove away in opposite directions. I watched him disappear in my rearview mirror, and I felt sad but also certain. Sometimes closure is the kindest kind of love. The idea came to me in my support group during a session where Patricia asked us what we wished people understood about family abuse. One woman said she wished people knew how loud silence could be, how the worst pain often came from things that were never said, needs that were never acknowledged, love that was never offered. I thought about that for weeks, about the power of silence, about how my family had used it as a weapon to erase me and how I might reclaim it as something else entirely. I reached out to the women from my group first, then to contacts from advocacy organisations, then to people who'd emailed me after my article was published. The message was simple. On the last Saturday in August, we would gather in Wade Oval Park in Cleveland. We would stand together in silence for 1 hour. No speeches, no chants, no signs with slogans, just our presence, our solidarity, and if we chose a photograph of the person who had hurt us most. The media could come, could film, could try to interview us afterward. But during that hour, we would speak only through our silence. I expected maybe 30 women, 50 if we were lucky. But as the day approached, the responses kept coming. Women from Ohio, from neighbouring states, some flying in from as far as California and Texas. They were daughters and sisters, mothers and grandmothers, women who'd been diminished by the people who should have protected them. By the morning of the gathering, we had over 200 confirmed attendees. I arrived at the park early before dawn and watched the sun rise over the city. My hair had grown out over the past months, but the night before I'd gone to Clara's salon and asked her to shave it again. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. This time the razor was an act of reclamation, not humiliation. Clara had understood without my having to explain. The women began arriving at 9. They came alone and in small groups, quietly taking their places in the arrangement we'd planned, forming a large circle in the centre of the park. Some held framed photographs, others held printed pictures, edges worn from being carried. I saw mothers holding photos of their own mothers, sisters holding images of siblings who'd betrayed them, wives with pictures of husbands who'd controlled and diminished them for decades. The media was already there, cameras set up at a respectful distance. A crowd of onlookers had gathered at the park's edges, drawn by the unusual nature of what was happening. But the women in the circle paid them no attention. We had not come for an audience. We had come for each other. At 10 o'clock exactly, I walked to the centre of the circle and stood there, my shaved head catching the morning light, my hands empty because I carried no photograph. My parents' faces were burned into my memory deeply enough. I didn't need a picture to remember what they'd taken from me. Around me, the other women raised their photographs, holding them at chest level, facing outward. And then we stood, silent, still, resolute. The hour passed in a strange, sacred quiet. People in the watching crowd stopped talking. The traffic noise from the nearby street seemed to fade. All that remained was the presence of 200 women who refused to shout their pain but demanded to be seen anyway. I looked at the faces around me, saw tears on some, fierce determination on others, and a kind of peace I recognised because I'd fought so hard to find it in myself. Cameras clicked softly. A few people in the crowd began to cry. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez standing at the edge, Aunt Helen beside her, both of them holding their hands over their hearts. When the hour ended, marked by a single bell tone from a nearby church, we slowly lowered the photographs and stood for another moment in shared acknowledgement. Then, without speaking, women began to embrace, to touch shoulders, to make small gestures of connection and understanding. A reporter approached me carefully, her microphone held low, respectful. "Can you tell us what this gathering means?" I looked at the women around me at the photographs still clutched in their hands, at the strength radiating from people who'd been told they were weak. "For too long we were silent because we were ashamed," I said quietly. "Today we're silent because we're strong. Because silence, when it's chosen, when it's shared, speaks louder than any words we could say." The footage aired on every major news outlet that evening. The image of 200 women standing in dignified silence, holding pictures of their abusers, became iconic almost overnight. Editorial after editorial called it the most powerful protest of the year. Social media exploded with people sharing their own stories, posting their own pictures, creating their own silent gatherings in cities across the country. Someone started a hashtag. Silence is strength. It trended for days. I watched it all from my apartment, humbled and a little overwhelmed by what a simple act of standing together had created. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests, speaking invitations, offers to turn the gathering into an annual event. But for that night, I just sat quietly thinking about how far I'd come from the woman who'd woken up with her head shaved, humiliated and broken. They once silenced me with shame. Now, my silence shakes the world. The letter arrived 3 days after the silent gathering, delivered by regular mail in a manila envelope with my mother's careful handwriting on the front. No return address, just my name and apartment number. I held it for a long time before opening it, feeling the weight of the pages inside, knowing that whatever it contained would change. Something would add another layer to a story I thought I'd finished writing. Inside were 10 pages of handwritten text, my mother's cursive, neat and precise, despite what must have been a shaking hand. I poured myself tea, sat by the window with the afternoon light falling across my lap and began to read. "Jennifer," it started. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to respond to this letter or to ever speak to me again. But I need you to understand something, not because it excuses what I did, but because you deserve to know the whole truth." She wrote about her own childhood, about growing up as the eldest daughter of Margaret Brooks, my grandmother. About how her mother had been cold and critical, always comparing her unfavourably to her younger sister Helen. About how nothing she did was ever good enough, how every accomplishment was dismissed, how she'd spent her entire youth trying to earn love that was never offered. When I was 16, my mother wrote, "Grandma told me outright that she wished Helen had been born first, that Helen was prettier, smarter, more deserving. When I got married, she didn't come to the wedding. When I had Melissa, she visited once and left after an hour. But when you were born, everything changed." The handwriting grew shakier, here ink blots where she'd pressed too hard or paused too long. "Grandma came to the hospital and held you for hours. She said you looked like her, that you had her eyes, her spirit. She doted on you in a way she never did with Melissa, never did with me. And when she got sick, when she knew she was dying, she told me she was leaving everything to you, not to me, not to her own daughter, to her granddaughter, because you reminded her of herself." I stopped reading, my hand trembling. I'd known my grandmother had chosen me, but I'd never understood what that choice had cost my mother, what it had meant to be skipped over entirely by your own parent in favour of your child. The letter continued. "I should have been happy for you. I should have protected that gift, honoured her wishes, made sure you knew how special you were to her. But I couldn't. Every time I looked at you, I saw the woman who rejected me. Every time someone complimented you, I heard my mother's voice saying I wasn't good enough. I turned you into the enemy when you were just a child who deserved love. I hurt you because I was hurt. And I told myself I was protecting Melissa, protecting the family, when really I was just punishing you for being loved by someone who never loved me. There were more pages detailing the ways she'd rationalised her choices, the gradual escalation from favouritism to active sabotage, the moment she realised what she'd become and couldn't find a way to stop. And then, near the end, you look like her Jennifer. Your face, your voice, the way you carry yourself. You are everything she was everything I could never be. And I hated you for it while simultaneously knowing you were innocent. That's the terrible truth I have to live with. I destroyed my daughter because my mother destroyed me, and nothing I say or do will ever make that right. The letter ended with a single paragraph. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that what Grandma did to me doesn't justify what I did to you. Hurt people, but that's an explanation, not an excuse. You broke the cycle by refusing to become like me. You stood up and told the truth instead of passing the pain to the next generation. I'm proud of you for that, even though I have no right to be. I set the letter down and looked out the window at the city below, at people going about their lives carrying their own histories of hurt and healing. 3 generations of women, all wounded by the one who came before. My grandmother had been cruel to my mother. My mother had been cruel to me. And I could have been cruel to Melissa or to my own children if I ever had them continuing the cycle endlessly. But I wouldn't. I'd chosen a different path. I'd chosen truth over revenge, boundaries over destruction, healing over perpetuating harm. Hurt people, but I refused to continue the cycle. I read the letter once, absorbing every word, every confession, every attempt at explanation. Then I folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk beneath a stack of old tax documents. I didn't throw it away. I didn't burn it or tear it up in some symbolic act of rejection. I simply put it somewhere I wouldn't see it unless I chose to look for it, and I knew I wouldn't choose to look for it. My mother wanted me to understand her pain, and I did. I understood it completely. But understanding someone's suffering doesn't obligate you to absolve them of the harm they caused. Empathy doesn't require reconciliation. I could acknowledge the cycle of hurt that had shaped my mother's cruelty without taking responsibility for fixing her or healing her or giving her the forgiveness she said she didn't expect but clearly wanted. She'd spent 33 years of my life making me responsible for her emotional needs. I wouldn't spend the rest of mine doing the same. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's releasing the need for an apology. And I released it, not because my mother had finally apologized, but because I no longer needed her to. Her words, her regrets, her explanations, they were hers to carry now. I'd carried them long enough. The afternoon had grown late while I'd been reading the sun, starting its slow descent toward the horizon. I needed air, needed movement, needed to be somewhere other than my apartment with that letter sitting in my desk drawer, like a weight I'd just set down but could still feel the phantom presence of. I grabbed my jacket and walked to the park a few blocks from my apartment. A small green space with walking paths and benches where people came to read or jog or watch their children play. The autumn air was crisp, tinged with the smell of leaves and distant wood smoke. I walked slowly, hands in my pockets, letting my mind settle into the rhythm of my footsteps. A woman passed me going the other direction, then stopped and turned back. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Jennifer Brooks?" I nodded, and her face broke into a smile that was equal parts shy and grateful. I was at the gathering. In the park, I just wanted to say thank you. I've been trying to set boundaries with my mother for years, and everyone kept telling me I was being cruel, that family is family, that I should just forgive and forget. But your story, what you did, it gave me permission to say no, to protect myself. I filed for a restraining order last week. Her eyes welled up. "Thank you for showing us it's okay to choose ourselves. She walked away before I could respond, and I stood there feeling the weight of her gratitude, the responsibility of having become accidentally a symbol for something larger than my own story. It wasn't the first time someone had recognized me, but each time it happened, I felt the same mixture of humility and discomfort. I'd never set out to be inspirational. I'd just been trying to survive. I continued walking and more people approached. A man who said his sister had stolen his inheritance and he'd finally decided to pursue legal action. A woman who'd left an abusive family and hadn't spoken to them in 3 years, who said my article had made her feel less guilty about that choice. An older woman who simply squeezed my hand and said, "Your grandmother would be proud." Each interaction was brief, respectful, kind. No one demanded anything from me or asked me to solve their problems. They just wanted to acknowledge a shared experience, a common understanding that sometimes the hardest and bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who hurt you, even when those people are family. I found a bench near the playground and sat down watching children swing and climb and run with the unself-conscious joy that comes from not yet knowing how complicated the world can be. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, broke away from the play structure and walked over to me. She had dark curls and serious eyes, and she stood in front of me for a moment, studying my face, with the directness only children can manage without it feeling rude. "Are you the brave lady from the video?" she asked. I smiled, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. "I'm not sure I'm brave. I just told the truth." She tilted her head considering this. "My mum says telling the truth when people don't want to hear it is the bravest thing you can do. She says you're a hero." She said it matter-of-factly, the way children state obvious truths, then ran back to the playground without waiting for a response. I watched her go, this little girl who thought I was a hero, and I thought about all the ways I'd never felt heroic. I'd felt scared and angry and broken and lost. I'd made mistakes, said things I regretted, hurt people I cared about in my fumbling attempts to protect myself. But I'd also stood up when it would have been easier to stay down. I'd told the truth when it would have been safer to stay silent. I'd chosen to break a cycle that had broken generations before me. Maybe that was bravery. Not the absence of fear or doubt or pain, but the willingness to act despite them. Not performing strength for an audience, but finding it in quiet moments when no one was watching. Not being perfect or unbreakable, but being willing to be seen as flawed and breakable and still deserving of dignity and respect. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I sat on that bench and watched the children play, and the joggers pass, and the world continue in its steady rotation, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not the kind that comes from resolution or closure, or having all your questions answered. The kind that comes from accepting that some questions don't have answers, some wounds don't fully heal, and some relationships can't be saved. The kind that comes from choosing yourself, your safety, your truth, even when the cost is high. I thought about my mother's letter sitting in that drawer, and I knew I'd made the right choice not responding. She'd written it for herself to ease her own guilt, to make sense of her own story, and that was fine. She was entitled to her narrative. But I was entitled to mine too, and my narrative didn't require her participation or approval or understanding. It just required me to keep showing up, keep choosing peace, keep refusing to pass the pain forward. Maybe bravery is just being yourself no matter who's watching. The house had been legally mine for months, but I hadn't gone inside until today. My parents had moved out weeks ago, and I'd hired a cleaning service to empty it to make it ready for whatever came next. But I hadn't been ready to step inside until this quiet morning in late September, when the air smelled like autumn and new beginnings. I stood on the front walkway, looking at the white siding and black shutters, the porch swing my father had built for Melissa, but never for me. The house looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing. It was just a house. And now it was mine. The key felt heavy in my hand as I walked up the steps. I'd had the locks changed, a symbolic gesture as much as a practical one. I slid the key into place, and turned hearing the click of tumblers falling into alignment and pushed the door open. Morning light flooded through the windows, illuminating empty rooms that felt both familiar and foreign. The living room, where I'd sat through countless dinners feeling invisible, was just space now, waiting to be filled with new meaning. I walked through slowly, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and I felt no ghosts, no lingering pain, just possibility. I climbed the stairs to what had been my bedroom, the small space at the end of the hall where I'd spent my childhood trying to be good enough. It was empty now, only indentations in the carpet showing where furniture had once been. This was where I'd woken up with my head shaved, looking in the mirror and seeing only humiliation. But that girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd fought for her truth, who'd chosen peace over bitterness. I reached up and touched my short hair, grown out to a pixie cut I actually liked. My hair would grow, or it wouldn't. It didn't matter. I was more than my appearance, more than anyone's approval, more than the sum of ways I'd been diminished. I walked back downstairs and out to the porch, sitting on the swing. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her yard next door watering flowers. She looked up and waved, and I waved back. Some family you're born into, some you choose, and some chooses you. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Mitchell. Checking in. "How are you doing?" I typed back. "I'm good, really good." And I meant it. I was good in a way that didn't depend on external validation or perfect circumstances. I was good because I'd survived, because I'd stood up, because I'd chosen myself when no one else would. I thought about my grandmother, about how she'd known I would need protecting, how she'd set up the trust to mature at 33, giving me time to grow strong enough to claim it, how she'd believed in me before I knew how to believe in myself. I wished I could thank her, tell her it had worked, tell her I'd finally become the woman she'd seen in me. They tried to make me less noticeable, I thought, looking out at the quiet street where I'd grown up, feeling like I didn't belong. They shaved my head to make me small, to humiliate me into silence, to break me before I could discover what they'd stolen. But they only made me shine brighter. They freed me from caring what they thought, from needing their approval, from the exhausting performance of trying to earn love that was never going to be offered. The sun climbed higher, warming my face. The world continued in its steady rhythm, and I was part of it now, not as the forgotten daughter or the victim, but just as myself. Whole and flawed and free and exactly enough. And that's how I finally became the woman I was meant to be.